All right. The committee will come to order. Before we get started, I want to say happy birthday to my dear and good friend from New York, the ranking member, Mr. Meeks. Who celebrated a very big birthday this week. He's now 70 years old. But can you give us that Muhammad Ali quote so we can? This is like the best line.
Ali always said, "Don't count the years, make the days count."
So we'll make it count. We're going to do that John Boehner birthday song real quick. That's all right. All right, Republicans, ready? This is your birthday song. It doesn't last too long. Hey. Yeah, we like to have some fun. We had a good time last night at the State Department, big music event, and the secretary played a rhythm and blues song. Amazing. So now we get on to something more, very important. Let me give an opening statement. Ranking member, I believe that Secretary Nuland, you'll be giving the statement. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress alone the authority to declare war. And I believe it's our most solemn power. Declarations of war and authorizations for use of military force are this committee's most consequential jurisdiction. And now we're 22 years past the 9/11 attacks. And while we've dramatically degraded those threats, we do face terrorists committed to our destruction. The bipartisan 9/11 Commission, led by New Jersey Governor Tom Kean, whose son is now on this committee, and former Democrat chair of this committee, Lee Hamilton, made clear that the fight against radical Islamist terror would be a, quote, generational challenge likely to be measured in decades, not years. For my years as a counterterrorism federal prosecutor and as former chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, I know that ongoing counterterrorism operations are legal and necessary and have saved us from many attacks. But Congress has not revisited our authorities in over 2 decades. 90% of current House members were not even here when Congress enacted the 2 key AUMFs still on the books. The 2001 post-9/11 AUMF has been used against al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and associated forces, including ISIS. 2002 Iraq AUMF was used against Saddam Hussein and also against terror threats in Iraq, including IRGC Commander Soleimani and Iran-backed militias. During that time, Congress has held hundreds of briefings and hearings. We've continued to appropriate funds for these engagements, but we haven't revisited the authorities Congress gave to the President 11 Congresses ago. War should not be on autopilot. Congress owes our troops a clear commitment to the missions we are asking them to undertake. We need to exercise our Article 1 war powers and stop our unhealthy ongoing deference to the executive branch. Our troops deserve that. My preference would be to repeal and replace all the AUMFs with a new, more limited authorization scope to the terror threats that we face today. It would not apply to foreign nations or armed forces. It would not provide authority to occupy and reconstruct a country. There's also bipartisan interest in making a new AUMF time-limited so that Congress is required to review and reauthorize more regularly. Doing this is hard, and that's why we haven't done it in 22 years. To succeed, a new AUMF requires bipartisan, bicameral, and presidential support. And it will require us to answer tough questions, such as which terrorist organization should be covered. As mentioned, current authorities cover al-Qaeda, the Taliban, associated forces, including ISIS. But the administration is asking us to now exclude the Taliban and not add any new Iran-backed terrorist militias to any new AUMF. I have to say that I have some concerns with that. Those groups have killed more Americans and pose ongoing threats today. Iran-backed militias have attacked U.S. personnel in the Middle East more than 80 times since the start of the Biden administration. During the Iraq War, they killed more than 600 Americans. Taliban actively harbors terror threats, including Zawahiri, bin Laden's top lieutenant, and until recently, the leader of al-Qaeda. The operational brains behind 9/11 was living in downtown Kabul under the Taliban's protection. Many specially designated global terrorists serve as senior officials now in the Taliban government, including Interior Minister Haqqani, head of the Haqqani Network, which is a designated foreign terrorist organization. It is simply not credible to exclude these extreme ongoing terror threats from a new counterterrorism AUMF. When the president says he can just address them using his Article 2 powers, he is telling Congress not to exercise our exclusive constitutional authority. There's no consensus about the scope of the president's inherent powers to use force, except in cases of self-defense after we have been attacked. I want the president to have that clear authority. He does not need to wait for these terrorists to attack us first. So with that, I want to thank our panel here today and the Secretary. This is a very important discussion we will have today. I don't want it to be, certainly this should not be a partisan exercise, but rather a bipartisan exercise. And I hope, is my sincere hope, that we can come together and mark up a new AUMF by next month. And so with that, I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, as a member of the House of Representatives from the state of New York, I know how much that day, September the 11th, 2001, weighs on the hearts of all Americans. Thousands of men and women in New York City, to this day, still bear the physical and emotional scars of 9/11, as does those in the Pentagon and in Pennsylvania. For them, for us, the phrase "never forget" is as much a memorial as it is daily reality. Days after the attack, on Friday, September the 14th, I recall being on the House floor and reading the resolution to authorize the president to use military force in response to that tragic attack on our homeland. Let me read the pertinent part aloud again today. The president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States. I voted for that authorization. And though I carry the burden of that vote, not for 1 second do I regret it. We needed to send a message. We needed to take action and prevent future terrorist attacks by those who orchestrated 9/11, and we did. But let us be clear. That AUMF, which my colleagues and I voted on, was about 9/11, its perpetrators, and those who gave them refuge. The targets and scope of the AUMF were clear. Al-Qaeda committed a terrorist attack on U.S. soil, and the Taliban had harbored them, refusing to hand over Osama bin Laden. My vote to cast authorized force against both Taliban and Al-Qaeda alike. The Taliban, for all of their counterproductive and backward policies and what they're doing today, did not warrant a proactive designation by Congress as an organization that the president is authorized to use military force against. They are fighting ISIS-K in Afghanistan and killed the organization's leader earlier this year. In 2001, AUMF repeal and replace bill should comport with that reality rather than revive a 20-year-old war, which we just ended, and which Americans have no interest in pursuing again. A repeal and replace bill should, however, retain the president's authority to target non-state actors that have the capability and intention to attack our homeland. I submitted and my proposed legislation includes 3 terrorist entities that the president would retain the right to use force against: ISIS-K in Afghanistan, ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Without getting into information inappropriate to this public forum, I believe that several ISIS affiliates remain a threat to the United States. President Biden ordered a strike that killed ISIS leader in 2022, and our military has taken out several top commanders in 2023. Several other ISIS leaders have been killed by partner forces. This constant pressure and the difficulty it creates for planning and executing terrorist operations keep us safer here at home, and it would be unwise to discontinue these operations. ISIS-K remains a top concern. ISIS-K continues to pose a threat to our country and remains engaged in global terror. Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan is significantly debilitated, but I do think operations like the 2022 strike against Al-Qaeda's leader in 9/11, plotter Ayman al-Zawahiri, should be authorized by Congress. It is possible that new intelligence could convince me to add or subtract entities from this list. These are not simple questions with easy answers, and I clearly understand that Mr. McCaul's draft legislation has a wider scope, and I hope that, as he stated, we can reach an agreement and dialogue together along with the administration. One thing I believe that I know we can agree on: we need to have this debate, and we need Congress to reassert its proper authority over the power to declare war under the Constitution. The time to pass, repeal, and replace of the 2001 AUMF legislation is now long overdue. The American people elected us to make tough decisions, not duck hard questions, by ceding our constitutional authority over the executive branch, or our constitutional order depends on us upholding that responsibility. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses here today before this committee. And again, I thank the chairman for calling this hearing this morning.
Now, I want to thank the ranking member. And I also want to thank Ken Buck and Dean Phillips for leading a task force, engaging conversations with various groups across the spectrum on both sides of the aisle to try to get to a consensus. And I know you put a lot of time and effort into this, and I want it to bear fruit at the end of this discussion. So we have a distinguished panel. First, Ambassador Victoria Nuland is Acting Deputy Secretary, Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the Department of State. Thank you for being here. Mr. Christopher Maier is the Assistant Secretary for Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. Ms. Caroline Krass is the General Counsel at the Department of Defense. And Mr. Richard Visek is the Acting Legal Advisor at the Department of State. So with that, I believe that we will call upon Ms. Nuland for her testimony.
Thank you, Chairman McCaul. Ranking Member Meeks, happy birthday. Members of the committee, thank you for inviting all of us to testify today. President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and the whole administration welcome the opportunity to work with Congress to update the existing authorizations for the use of military force. It's in that spirit that we gather today, as both of you said, to consider some of the gravest and weightiest questions we face as public servants. Questions about how to address and eliminate emerging and imminent dangers to our citizens, when the use of military force is appropriate, and how those decisions should be made. 22 years ago, the 9/11 terrorist attacks violently reminded our country of the threats we faced and renewed our national resolve to secure our homeland. Out of that moment of tragedy came a measure of unity. In the aftermath, members of the Congress came together to enact the 2001 AUMF, which created the legal bedrock of U.S. counterterrorism operations, enabling us to dismantle key terrorist organizations and thwart their plans to attack Americans. The world is a different place now. The threat of terrorism persists, but it's also evolved. So too must the tools that we use to meet it. We applaud congressional efforts to update this law to reflect the realities of the current landscape. There is no more powerful signal we can send to those who wish us harm than a new authorization which is broadly supported by both chambers of Congress and by both parties. We agree that repealing and replacing the 2001 AUMF is warranted and is necessary. Here is how the administration sees some of the key issues, some of which you've already highlighted in your opening statements. First, when it comes, what comes next should provide our military with uninterrupted authority to continue critical operations authorized by the 2001 law and provide the flexibility to rapidly adapt to constantly changing dangers. Second, a revised AUMF should explicitly authorize force against al-Qaeda and ISIS. Third, a revised AUMF, in our view, should not include a date-certain expiration date given the persistence of this threat. That said, we know how critical this issue is for members of this committee, and we are prepared to discuss ways to review the continuing need for these authorities on an agreed and regular basis. Fourth, a revised AUMF should ensure uninterrupted authority for terrorist detention operations. And finally, we believe a revised AUMF should enable us to apply this authority to new geographic areas and groups as needed. While the rate of global terrorist attacks has declined, groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda maintain safe havens across the globe, and in an intent to attack our nation and our people overseas. Over the past decade, we've built and led a successful coalition to root out ISIS, to reduce its territory, and to disrupt its recruitment and financial networks. Yet these groups continue to pose threats to the United States and our interests, whether it's al-Shabaab in Somalia, ISIS-K in Afghanistan, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, to ISIS in Syria. At the same time, terrorist activities in the Sahel are on the rise, a trend that is likely to worsen with increased political instability in the region. Meanwhile, we've taken significant steps towards closing the facility at Guantanamo Bay, and that remains our goal. But until that day comes, we can't afford any gaps in our detention authorities. We know that military force is only part of the answer to countering terrorist threats. With the support of the Congress, we are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in State Department-run programs in countries around the world to train, mentor, and equip law enforcement officers in counterterrorism, to work effectively and to respect the rule of law and human rights. We've also worked with partners in more than 25 countries across the globe to combat racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. And through the Global Counterterrorism Forum, we've collaborated with over 40 countries to increase the resilience of local communities to terrorist actors. But given the evolving threat, we must be able to use force when necessary to prevent groups from planning attacks, reestablishing footholds, reconstituting, and resurging. As we consider a new AUMF, we support congressional engagement on the use of this authorization, including which terrorist groups should be the targets. The administration is deeply committed to working with Congress on this new authorization and to remaining accountable to the American people for actions that are taken under the AUMF. We look forward to a very frank discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. As we had a classified briefing last week as well. It was a very robust discussion, and it seems to me there are three issues. Whether or not to keep the Taliban on the list. As I mentioned, Haqqani is their Minister of Interior and was harboring Zawahiri. Haqqani Network being a foreign terrorist organization. And the other one has to do with Iran Shia militia groups. General Kurilla testified 6 months ago that these Iran-backed militias had attacked us 78 times, our military, since January 2021. And then finally, as you mentioned, the timeline. I think it has to be realistic. It's taken us 22 years to have this discussion, and that's for a reason, because it's hard. It's hard to get consensus. And so I'd asked your legal counsel at the time to come up with maybe some creative options to that. I will say I think most members do want a time certain to an expiration to force future Congresses to deal with the issue. But having said that, those are the three big issues as I see it. If I could maybe start with you, Madam Secretary, and then go down the panel.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to take these in turn, and I'm going to guess we'll come back around and around to them. But first, with regard to the Taliban, we've been very clear. We're going to judge the Taliban by their actions. It is our assessment that the Taliban have partially adhered to their CT commitments. We've seen them disrupt ISIS-K, for example, but there's obviously plenty more to do to ensure that Afghanistan doesn't become a safe haven or return to safe haven or persist as a safe haven. That said, I would note that the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Christy Abizaid, recently said publicly that al-Qaeda is at its historic nadir in Afghanistan, and its revival is unlikely. I would say we have been able, with the authorities that we have, to maintain persistent counterterrorism action against al-Qaeda, most recently with the August 22 strike against Zawahiri. So the president is not going to hesitate to go after al-Qaeda as he needs to, and we believe that we have the authorities under Article 2 to do that. With regard to the Iran-backed militias, Iran is obviously a state sponsor of terrorism. It is the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world. And as this committee knows very well, and especially those of you who serve selflessly in Iraq and elsewhere, they continue in this effort. President Biden has repeatedly warned Iran that we will hold them to account for any role in attacks against U.S. personnel, and the president, again, has done just that using his Article 2 authorities, most recently in March in Syria, and he's not going to hesitate to do that again. So again, this is a place where we believe we have the authorities that we need, and the president has shown his willingness to use them under Article 2, but obviously we're open to further conversation about this.
And I would just say that, yeah, that's your Article 2 authorities, self-defense, but that's not an authority authorized by Congress, though. But please continue.
Understood, but in this case, when they attack us, we respond is the way that that has worked. And in fact, what we're trying to do is restore deterrence, and we feel that has, we've sent that message strongly in March, and we have not seen any attacks since. With regard to the sunset, we have a number of things that we can talk about. As you said, Chairman, a number of concrete proposals. I can run them down here, or we can do it later. I think our biggest issue with a firm date certain is it signals to our adversaries that they can wait us out. That's the biggest problem. It also signals to the partners we want to work with that they can't count on us to lead this effort after that if the Congress is not able to continue the authority. So that's our biggest concern. So we've put forward to members of this committee and to the staff some ideas for, as we said, regular reviews at set intervals, more reporting requirements, or even the requirement at a date that you set for a presidential certification and a conversation about the need to continue these authorities. We think that's a better way to go than setting a date now and telling the world that we're potentially out of this business on that date. So let me pause there. Chris, anything to add?
Chairman, the only thing I would add, especially on the sunset provision, is I think one of the strengths we see still to this day in things like the de-ISIS coalition is really the consistency and sustainability of that coalition, and we continue to be, frankly, surprised on many of the capitals that continue to renew mandates in Iraq and Syria long after they've stopped contributing forces. And I think if we look at this in the context of a sunset provision that has a time-directed end, those partners would become far less certain about making those political commitments, sir.
And, you know, I do see some merit to that, because we would also say conditions on the ground, not a time base to give a signal to the enemy when it's going to expire. So my time is running out, but I look forward to visiting with you about these options that you have proposed, and thank you for that. Chair recognizes Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me make sure that, so we're absolutely clear, and I guess Undersecretary Nuland, does the administration believe a repeal and replace of the 2001 AUMF should include an explicit authorization to use military force to strike the Taliban?
Chairman, as I said, with regard to actions in Afghanistan, we want to see an explicit authorization for ISIS, for al-Qaeda. We do not believe that the Taliban needs to be in this authorization.
And what about, does the administration believe a repeal and replace of the 2001 AUMF should include an explicit authorization to use military force against Iranian-backed Shia militia groups?
Again, Ranking Member, we believe that we have proven that we have the authority under Article 2 to help defend the American people and restore deterrence, so we don't think that's necessary.
And does the administration support a repeal of the 2001 AUMF without a simultaneous replacement bill?
We do not. We would, immediately lose our detention authorities. We would lose our ability to strike al-Qaeda and ISIS and other groups.
And let me jump to, a couple of things, because I agree that what the chairman said about some of the key issues. And as I said, I'm very firm about, not giving over our authority to the executive branch. We've got to take the hard votes ourselves. So can any one of you tell me with precision the threat landscape in 2045? Which terrorist groups will be on the rise then, and what threats will they pose to the United States in 2045?
I certainly would not want to get out my crystal ball. I don't know if Assistant Secretary Maier would like to get his out. We just hope we're still celebrating your birthdays.
Me too. So, with that, because when I stood on the House floor in 2001 and voted for the 2001 AUMF, I can tell you that I firmly and squarely and honestly that most of the members, if not all of the members of Congress, did not believe that we were authorizing a global war on terror that would still be in force 22 years later. But that's where we are now. So why should members of this committee have the confidence that if we pass a new AUMF this year, that the president in 2045 will not use our law in ways we could have never predicted?
Well, again, Ranking Member, our commitment to you is that we will continue to evolve both the groups and the needs, geographic and otherwise, together. And there are many ways that we can establish regular consultation to do that, regular ways to agree to do that, as I said in my opening. And we think that's going to be necessary. We're going to need an open door to be able to evolve this or to update it again.
So, that's why, for me, because I know I can't, as you couldn't, see what's going to take place in 2045. But I can picture in my mind's eye, say what it looks like in 2024 or 2025 or 2026. And that's why, to me, a sunset makes sense. It forces us to stop and reevaluate if things change on the ground or use a military force, the use of a military force has been on statutory autopilot for 2 decades. And that's part of the reason why our policies, I believe, have been flawed. And I don't think Congress must have made the same errors. And that's why I think that we need to have a sunset so that we can review that. Let me just tell you real quickly, the other pet peeve that I have had recently, and I don't know whether Ms. Krass has this answer or not, but are you familiar with Section 1285 report codified as 50 U.S.C. 1550 that the Department of Defense sent to the House Foreign Affairs Committee this week?
Yes, sir, I am.
Do you know if the statutory language mandating the report states that the report shall be submitted a few days before every full committee, Foreign Affairs or AUMF issues, or does it state that the report shall be submitted every 180 days and that briefing shall occur in the 180-day window?
The latter, sir.
Okay. So, look, I have tremendous respect for the men and women who protect our national security every day across the Department of Defense and the Department of State, and understand the workload is significant and the burden is real. I even understand that sometimes Congress mandates reports that are outdated or useless. But that 1550 report is one that is necessary for Congress to do its job. And I again underscore and emphasize, as I did in 2022, look, for us to do our job, we have to have the report. So please, give us those reports in a timely manner. And I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for organizing this hearing and updating the United States authorization for U.S. military against terrorists that seek to kill Americans is urgently needed in the current threat landscape. Since the administration's shameful, I think, and tragic flight from Afghanistan 2 years ago, the Taliban has been left to help manage the very significant terror threats emanating from Afghanistan. And I know we're talking about leaving them out and really focusing on ISIS, K, and Al-Qaeda, but I do want to say here that Taliban is a U.S. adversary that funds funds Al-Qaeda. It employs Al-Qaeda members and it permits Al-Qaeda training camps. I'd be interested in some of your thoughts in this regard. I want to add to that, though, that meanwhile, Iran has only grown bolder and more aggressive in its support for terrorist proxies, I think we've seen. And I will note here, too, that the administration's policies have been exceedingly counterproductive. In fact, the administration recently signaled to Tehran that its bad behavior will be, in fact, rewarded with cash payouts to the tune of $6 billion. Let's be clear. Iran is a state sponsor of terror. U.S. policy must always, always aim to deter or punish Iran's use of terrorist proxies to harm Americans and sow instability across the Middle East. The U.S. must, retain a powerful toolkit here that empowers us to address these threats to our citizens and homeland. And Congress has an important opportunity to update and strengthen this toolkit, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on this critical effort. Assistant Secretary Maier, can you speak to a little bit both the Taliban activity that I have outlined and their involvement with Al-Qaeda and the camps and such, along with the total attacks? How many have Iran-backed militia groups made on American targets in the last 5 years? We know that Commander Kurilla testified quite a while ago here earlier that there were 78 attacks. Surely there have been more. I'm wondering if you can give us an update both on those Iran backed militias and proxies and then Taliban. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. So starting with the Taliban, I think as Secretary Nuland said, we are in a verify, not trust with the Taliban. But I think what we have seen is them take the fight to ISIS Khorasan because they are definitely opposed from a number of different reasons, namely because ISIS Khorasan attempts to undermine the Taliban governance, and the Taliban have pressured and managed to exert a fair degree of control, we would say, over the al-Qaeda elements that still remain in Afghanistan to ensure that they aren't conducting plotting against Western targets. Now,
Are they still funding, excuse me, are they still funding al-Qaeda? Do they still employ al-Qaeda members? Are they still permitting al-Qaeda training camps, the Taliban?
I think some of that would probably be better handled in a different session, but I think on balance we see that the Taliban remains in some sort of relationship with al-Qaeda, but what we have not seen is significant plotting by al-Qaeda towards Western interests, and I think Secretary Nuland's reference to NCTC Director Abizaid is telling there that al-Qaeda is being kept under wraps by the Taliban at this point. That said, we are carefully watching all of that because we know ultimately what al-Qaeda's intents are. I think on Iran, I would not be able to give you the accurate number over the last 5 years of Iranian proxy attacks, but I can tell you since General Kurilla testified, we've seen a clear drop in Iranian proxy attacks towards U.S. forces in both Iraq and Syria.
Okay, thank you. I want to move on and leave this question. I may not have enough time for it to be answered, but we see terrorism is exploding in sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel. Sub-Saharan Africa accounted for 60% of all terrorism deaths last year. The Sahel was the site of 43% of terrorism deaths, up from 1% in 2007. Assistant Secretary Maier and Ms. Krass, what are the key terrorist organizations in Africa and which are currently covered by the 2001 AUMF? And do you agree that a new AUMF must continue to cover those groups? I know that I am out of time. I'd appreciate it if I could get an answer in writing, Mr. Chairman, and because I do think it's important that we include sub-Saharan Africa in this discussion, especially with the explosion of terrorist activities that are going on. And I thank you, and I yield back.
General yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Sherman.
I agree with the ranking member. We shouldn't be on autopilot. I hope my colleagues would join me in introducing legislation to repeal the AUMF of 1957, dealing with communism in the Middle East, and 1991, dealing with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. We should also repeal the 2002 AUMF. I agree with the ranking member that we need to revise the 2001 AUMF and put a sunset on it. Ms. Nuland argues, well, that will embolden our enemies. That's because everybody in the executive branch believes that when the executive branch makes foreign policy, that they make good foreign policy and instill fear in our enemies. But if, God forbid, Congress has a binding role, then we would make bad decisions and our enemies would be emboldened. Nothing exemplifies this more than what every administration since the Nixon administration has said about everything we're talking about here today. The AUMF is meaningless, and all of our discussion at this hearing and many other hearings is meaningless unless the War Powers Act is binding on the administration. Yet since the Nixon administration, the executive branch has told us it's not binding. They've taken the position that it's really kind of a non-binding resolution, maybe with a few reporting requirements, but that every president can send our troops anywhere for as long as that president wants, whether Congress wants to authorize it or not. And then they work with us on the technicalities of the war powers of the AUMF to humor us, distract us, and pretend like it's important so that we never realize that it's not. Ms. Nuland, is the War Powers Act binding on the executive branch? And I'll point out that Senator Biden said yes. What's your answer?
Yes.
It is.
Sherman.
So the administration will follow the law and will not deploy troops for over 60 or 90 days unless authorized by an AUMF?
That is President Biden's commitment.
I might add that I asked that same question of your predecessor and did not get an answer at this committee just a year and a half ago, and I want to thank you for that commitment. Mr. Visek, as a matter of law? Is the War Powers Act binding on the executive branch?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. We're certainly aware of the history between the
Yes or
executive
no?
branch and the legislative branch on
Yes
these
or no?
issues.
Is it binding?
There are, certainly, I think there would be general agreement that parts of the War Powers Act are
Is
absolutely.
the part of it that says you can't deploy troops for over 60/90 days binding on the administration or not? Yes or no?
I can say that this administration has acted consistently with.
Acting consistently, they act consistently with many of our non-binding resolutions. Is it binding, or is it just something you choose to go along with?
Congressman, I'm not aware that it's been addressed at this point. I've wanted to defer to
Okay,
the
so
Office
we
of
have a
Legal Counsel.
disagreement. Your client says it's binding, you say it's not. Every administration is, prior to the statements of Ms. Nuland, have said it's not binding, and that's why last decade I put a provision, it's the most important thing I ever enacted into, or proposal that it was actually enacted into law, that says that no money can be spent in contravention of the War Powers Act. Now, Attorney General Mukasey testified before this committee a long time ago that if such a provision was in the appropriations bill, was in the appropriations bill back a decade ago, because I finally want to vote on the floor. It's now in base text, so it doesn't get much attention. But it says no money can be spent in contravention. Is that provision binding, Mr. Visek?
Congressman, I'm not aware that this administration has taken a position on that. We'd
Well,
have
you
the Office of
realize that
Legal
you were
Counsel.
sitting there when Wendy Sherman, no relation, said that the administration would look at that provision and reach a decision on that. Was she misleading us when she said the administration would look at that?
I do not believe Deputy Secretary
You were sitting right
Sherman
next to her.
would mislead this committee. All I can say is that I'm not
Will
aware.
you get back with a yes or no answer as to whether, in your legal opinion, the money can be spent in contravention of the War Powers Act out of the Defense Appropriations Bill that says no money shall be spent in contravention of the War Powers Act? Ms. Krass, you'll be advising generals. Now and then we say no money shall be spent in the defense bill for this or that. And if they just ignore that, they could, I believe, go to jail. Would you advise defense officials that they could spend money in contravention of the War Powers Act if that money was appropriated by a bill that says no money shall be spent in contravention thereof?
Congressman, we very much respect the role of Congress, and clear language such as no money can be sent implicates, as you say, the Anti-Deficiency Act. We would always comply with that, consistent with our constitutional.
So as long as we put that provision in every defense appropes bill, and we frankly, and I hope my colleagues will join this, should put it in permanent law, you believe that the Defense Department has to abide by it?
Consistent with our constitutional obligations, yes.
Consistent with your constitutional, do you have a constitutional right to ignore it?
It would very much depend on the circumstances. It would be very unusual that we would.
Okay, so sometimes you can ignore laws you don't like,
Only if there's a
depending upon the
constitutional issue.
circumstances. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary, I'm going to ask you some very straightforward questions. I would say it's in everybody's best interest to give us simple and straightforward answers. It's an opportunity to clear the air on some ongoing issues. There is currently an allegation that your Chief of Staff, who was also a former aide for Robert Malley, an Iran deal architect, who is currently has a revoked security clearance and is suspended for classified mishandling, allegedly, that she was a part of a group known as the Iran Expert Initiative, which reported to the Iranian Foreign Ministry and had the mission of influencing U.S. policymakers to agree with what the Iranian government wanted. That is an allegation. The Pentagon issued a defense saying that the doctor was thoroughly and properly vetted and that we are honored to have her serve. I like to believe that in issuing a defense, that was thoughtful and thoroughly vetted as well, and I want you to give you the opportunity to substantiate that. So my questions are going to start with this. They will be very straightforward. Given that a defense was issued, I want to confirm what was reviewed to substantiate that defense. Did your chief of staff have any affiliation with a group known as the Iranian Expert Initiative, its other reported associates, or any groups reporting to the Iranian Foreign Ministry?
So, Congressman Mast, I think you'll appreciate this is an ongoing personnel matter. We received the letter from the House Armed Services Committee Chairman and Ranking Member, or excuse me, Subcommittee Chair of the Intelligence Special Operations Committee 2 days ago. So we're looking into that. I think the initial response you're referring to was issued by our public affairs folks. We are actively looking into whether all law and policy was properly followed in granting my chief of staff top secret, special compartmented information.
Let's pause on that.
Yes.
Was the security clearance a full scope polygraph background check, a single scope background check? Can you speak to that?
I can't at this point. I don't know that information, sir.
Can you speak to the SF-86 National Security Questionnaire? Straightforward questions. They're black and white. And so I would ask this. Can you say in Section 19, foreign contacts, was anybody listed within her contacts as a part of the Iranian Foreign Ministry?
So, Congressman, I think you'll understand that I am not involved in the vetting process for security clearance. That is part of what we're looking into when I say ensuring it's consistent with law and policy. That would be a routine part of a background investigation from my experience.
Absolutely.
Sir.
Can you help me with timeline on something on this? Understanding the SF-86 National Security Questionnaire, the questions relating to foreign associates, work, foreign business dealings, they have a 7-year statute of limitations for the questions. Records show that she began working for Mr. Malley roughly in 2021, and the allegation is that this took place in roughly 2013, 2014. Can you substantiate that if this was not listed, it may be because of the lapse of time, the 7-year time window that would put it just outside of that?
Yeah, again, Congressman, I don't have that level of detail what went into her security clearance, but I think there are certainly pieces that have, as investigations are underway, as I understand it, they have discretion to look beyond that timeline as is required.
To the General Counsel, I would ask you the same questions.
We are more than happy to take back your questions, sir.
Can you substantiate, did the Chief of Staff have any affiliation with a group known as the Iranian Expert Initiative, its other reported associates, or any groups reporting to the Iranian Foreign Ministry?
I don't know that.
Okay. Can you substantiate whether that association, that alleged association, very alleged association, would have been outside of the time frame in which she had to report according to her national security questionnaire?
I do not know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. Barra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for holding this hearing. I mean, this is not a Democratic or Republican issue. This is not a House or Senate issue. It's something we talked about during the last administration. And again, from the comments of the witnesses, I think the Biden administration also would love to see a sunset of the 2001 AUMF and a modernization of an AUMF that reflects today's world. I wasn't in Congress post 9/11, but vividly remember the days immediately after 9/11 where the country came together. We weren't Democrats or Republicans. We were all Americans, and watched this institution come together as well. And I think there's a very nonpartisan, bicameral desire to continue to do this and give the administration, whether it's a Democratic or Republican administration, the flexibility and ability to protect the American homeland and American interests around the world. I think this is a place where we should work together and provide that flexibility for future administrations. Thinking about the sunset provision, I certainly understand the the delicacy of setting a hard timeline. But I do think there's a compromise that can probably be reached where there are some forcing functions, some reporting functions that come back that don't set a hard and fast timeline, but also give the legislative body the reassurances that, on whether it's every Congress coming back to, the chairs of the relevant committees, Congress as a whole, et cetera, and reporting that. And again, I think that certainly can be negotiated and to where the executive branch is comfortable, we're comfortable, and we protect the homeland. I also worry about future threats, and I appreciate none of us has a crystal ball, and the current AUMF addresses Al-Qaeda and ISIS and affiliated groups like Al-Shabaab, et cetera. But when I think about what keeps me awake at night, having being both on the Foreign Affairs and the Intelligence Committee, and having traveled extensively throughout the Middle East recently, you see countries like Yemen, and I do think there's a very real possibility that you'll get some stabilization in South Yemen. But I look at North Yemen, I look at the Houthi movement, I look at a large number of young men, heavily armed, nothing to do, no economy, et cetera. And I'd also like to think about how do we, the Houthis would not be covered under this AUMF, and I'm not suggesting that they should, but if a new rebel movement or counter-terror movement emerges, how do we allow the flexibility to address new threats? And I don't expect you to have that answer, but I do think it's important for us to give that flexibility. Certainly Article 2 would allow some immediate threats, but having to come back to Congress every time, I think there's, am I thinking about this correctly? Maybe Secretary Nuland.
Thank you, Congressman Bera, and particularly for your openness to finding other ways to re-up these authorities short of date certain for the reasons that we've talked about. I've worked for a number of presidents who've tried to, of both parties, who've tried to amend this and with the Congress, and it's difficult. So we don't want to put ourselves in a position where we have a gap. What we would also favor, in addition to what we put explicitly in the law, is provisions where we could come back to you to ask for additional groups to be covered, whether we did that in open or whether we did that in a classified way so as not to signal, but we would be open to that for sure.
Great, thank you. And just my last question, was recently in Mexico City, and I know some of my colleagues have introduced an AUMF to think about transnational drug cartels. I will just go on the record that I think that's a bad idea at this juncture, and that's not to suggest that we don't have to use all means that we have as the federal government to address fentanyl, address these transnational drug cartels, but to our partners in Mexico, I think there are better ways for us to go about stamping out what is a major issue here in the United States and certainly abroad.
We agree with that. We think we should use criminal statutes against criminals and terrorist statutes against terrorists.
Great, thank you, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Buck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to help on this issue. It's been a pleasure and an honor to work with you and the ranking member on this issue. I guess I want to just make one statement about sunsets. Regular reviews don't work in Congress. We have a regular review of our appropriations process, and we have a term for it. It's called shutdown. We have a regular review of a debt ceiling, and it's called almost defaulting. We have a regular review of many programs that we, as Congress, have authorized in the executive branch, and 1,400 of those programs are unauthorized. We still appropriate to. Regular reviews don't work. When there is something significant like FISA, we have a deadline accompanying that important program. We get our job done. Sometimes we have to kick it for a few months in order to get our job done, but we get our job done. It is holding the collective feet of Congress to the fire that allows us to get something done. A review just doesn't work. The can will be kicked down the road. We won't do our job. And more importantly, the men and women who are risking their lives won't have the support of Congress. It is too easy for members of Congress to go run around and say, I never supported that and I'm not going to appropriate money to it because we didn't do our job of reviewing it. So I would really ask that you reconsider your position on a sunset. It will certainly be something that I will be pushing for. But my question really is a little bit different, and that is, how does a terrorist group earn its way onto a list that gets targeted? What are the considerations? And I guess, Assistant Secretary Maier, I'm directing this to you. In my mind, there are a few things. One, the group has explicitly sought to harm U.S. interests, whether they're personnel or embassies, or aided and abetted another group in that endeavor, or sworn allegiance to a group that is involved in that. But I'd love to know, and really this is the key to me to gaining the confidence of other members in Congress, that we are carefully considering this. It isn't just we saw something in a newspaper and decided to target a group.
Congressman Buck, it's a really important question, and I think we would look at it at the most basic as a group that has both the intent and capability to harm Americans, and by that we're talking individual American citizens. We often use broad sweeping terms like U.S. interest in the United States and the homeland, but we're talking about groups that have a consistent, sustained intent to harm Americans and also have the capability to do so. And then I think as we move past that, we apply really a policy test to look at those groups that we would add as associated forces or affiliates, those that are associated with the larger al-Qaeda and ISIS group. And there's really two tests to that. One is that it's an armed group, so meaning it has the capability, and it has entered the fight against the United States aligned with al-Qaeda. Which is going back to the core of how this 2001 AUMF started. And then the second is this group is a co-belligerent with al-Qaeda against the United States. And I think I already kind of covered that, but the intent has to be there to strike at the United States. So we go through extensive policy discussions on the executive side, informed by a whole host of information, a lot of it coming in, of course, classified, sir.
So I'm interested in, you use the word interest, and I guess capability is something that I'm interested in also. Obviously, we have embassies, we have a lot of American interests in other countries. The interest doesn't have to be attacking the homeland.
Correct, sir. Yes, we would look at it from the perspective of threats to Americans. Those can be official Americans working in embassies, but those can also be private citizens. And in fact, much of what we've seen al-Qaeda and ISIS focus on in recent years are soft targets. So those could be tourist locations, those could be businesses that are less protected because they're frankly easier targets.
I'd love your help with,
including overseas, yes, absolutely.
I'd love your help with trying to identify that in more specific terms. The one thing that we're great at is sort of giving broad discretion to the executive branch and then blaming the executive branch for abusing or using that broad discretion. I thank you for your answers, and I yield back.
Joan yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Nuland. Thank you to our panel for your testimony today on this very important discussion. As you all know, the Constitution reserves the power to declare war to Congress, and this committee has jurisdiction over authorizations for the use of military force. Both Democratic and Republican administrations have seized more and more authority to unilaterally use force, and congressional inaction, I believe, has enabled this. I appreciate Chairman McCaul's decision to consider a repeal and replacement of the 2001 authorization of the use of military force, and look forward to the debate on this committee, so Congress can reclaim these authorities that have been ceded over the last 2 decades. And I want to first raise an alarming issue that it's recently gained traction, and Representative Bear alluded to it. It's gained traction, and I fear it's leading our country down a very dark path. There's now open discussion about the use of force in Mexico to take on cartels including airstrikes, the deployment of armed forces, and special forces operations. I'm alarmed that many are threatening to do so with or without the cooperation of the Mexican government, which could be considered an act of aggression and a violation of international law. I'm raising these issues and questions to get the administration on the record today, and I'm directing these questions to Ms. Krass. Is there any interpretation of the 2001 AUMF that would allow the use of force against cartels in Mexico?
We would not interpret the cartels in Mexico to be associated forces of al-Qaeda.
Are you aware of any executive branch opinion or memo that says the President's Article 2 power to repel sudden attacks would permit the use of force against cartels?
So the way that we have interpreted through the Justice Department, the Article 2 power is a two-pronged test. One, whether a use of force would serve an important national interest, and two, whether or not the use of force would be likely to rise in terms of both the use and the response and escalatory response to war in the constitutional sense. Just as you said, Congress has the power to declare war under the Constitution, and so that's the twofold test that would be applied.
But to the best of your understanding, any memo or policy that you've seen in the executive branch, is it your understanding today that that would include the cartels?
I've not seen anything that would indicate that, no.
What steps should Congress take to prevent overbroad interpretations of Article 2 that a future administration might try to use to justify congressionally unauthorized hostilities with cartels?
Well, that's something that I would have to take back to consider. I think that it's very important that the executive branch can be required to consult with Congress and to engage with you fully on our interpretations of the law.
Thank you so much. Mr. Visek, this question is for you. Under the UN Charter, states may use force without the territorial state's consent only in response to an, quote, armed attack or with the permission of the United Nations Security Council. Does manufacturing, transporting, or selling fentanyl rise to the level of a, quote, armed attack in international law?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I'm not aware of any statement by anyone to suggest that it would comply with international law. Normally, the UN Charter talks about the use of force, and that is, or the threats of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state.
So as far as you could tell, as far as you know, that would be outside the definition.
You know, I always hesitate to engage in any hypotheticals, but it's not an interpretation that immediately jumps to mind as the correct one.
Sure. Thank you, sir. It's important that my colleagues get on the record about how unwise it would be to start a war with Mexico in this manner. And I'll soon be introducing a resolution rejecting the use of unilateral force in Mexico. And so I encourage my colleagues to please get in touch with me if they are in agreement and would like to support such a resolution. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Barr.
Thank you. Secretary Nuland, welcome back to the committee. In June of this year, the President claimed that al-Qaeda was not present in Afghanistan and that the U.S. was, quote, getting help from the Taliban. This ostensibly would explain the administration's policy request of excluding the Taliban from any new AUMF. But in June of this year, there was a UN report that outlined the threat that al-Qaeda poses in Afghanistan. According to the report, there are 30 to 60 senior al-Qaeda officials and 400 fighters in Afghanistan today. The Taliban provides monthly welfare payments to al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has safe houses, training camps, and trained suicide bombers in Afghanistan. At least 3 al-Qaeda members are serving in the Taliban's government. The Taliban issues passports and identity paperwork to foreign AQ members. So my question is, why would the administration want to exclude the Taliban from an AUMF?
Thanks, Congressman Barr. I think I'm not sure if you've been here from the beginning.
I have.
Yeah. So as we said at the outset, we do see the Taliban in their own interest, as Assistant Secretary Maier underscored, taking action against ISIS-K. And we also see the capability of al-Qaeda in the current moment significantly reduced and attrited including its ability to plot and plan and strike the homeland. So, you know, with regard to the President's statement, we could address some of those things in a different setting than this one.
Well, we
but-
don't need a different setting. We don't need to go to the SCIF. This is a UN report. This is open source of the Taliban actively giving aid and comfort and assistance to terrorists. And the further question for any of them is the Taliban killing our Afghan allies that this administration left behind?
I'm going to defer to Assistant Secretary Maier on what we've seen the Al-Qaeda be able to.
I think that's
Taliban
a very,
able to
very
do.
important question. Is the Taliban murdering our Afghan allies today in Afghanistan? And if they are, why are they not in an AUMF? Or why should they not be in an AUMF?
I don't believe we've seen a consistent pattern of those Afghans who worked and supported our efforts in Afghanistan being murdered by the Taliban.
My
but I defer to
constituents,
Chris.
Marines at HKIA, can tell you. They can tell you what the Taliban were doing when we were leaving. I represent Marines who are at HKIA. They know what the Taliban were doing and planning to do to our Afghan allies that we abandoned. They know. The Taliban is not our friend. Secretary Maier, it is also puzzling that the administration opposes inclusion of Iran-backed militia groups in a new AUMF, despite the fact that these very groups are responsible for dozens of attacks against U.S. service members in the region. Is the administration wishing to not list Iran-backed groups in exchange for keeping the door open to a potential future Iranian nuclear deal?
Congressman, I think we have said that the purpose of not putting Iranian-backed groups on this list is because we can already exercise all the military.
Yeah, I
force
heard that
we need.
testimony earlier. We've got a Georgetown law grad and we have a Yale law grad in the administration sitting right next to you. And I know that they've read the Youngstown decision and the concurring opinion from Justice Jackson. And I'd like to ask the lawyers, is the administration invoking of Article 2 operating in a zone of twilight? Shouldn't we in Congress specifically authorize use of force against these murderers of U.S. service members to give the president, the commander-in-chief, the zenith of his power here? I ask the lawyers.
Congressman, you are absolutely correct that the president's power under Youngstown is at its zenith, as you say, when both Congress and the president are acting together. But we believe that the nature of the threat from the IMGs is one that the president has been able to address thus far and has not shied away from addressing under his constitutional authority.
Well, I don't have time for a final question, and I'm not really going to disagree necessarily with you on the president's Article 2 powers, but I think it would be wise, given the fact that these are groups that are killing U.S. service members, that Congress authorized the president to give him maximum authority and flexibility with respect to responding to those attacks against U.S. service members in Iraq and Syria. I've run out of time, so I'll yield back, but I could go on for more time. Yield.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. Both the Biden administration and senior military officials have made it clear, on several occasions that the 2002 AUMF no longer underpins any of our military operations. And the president said he would sign legislation that repeals it, passed by both chambers. So, I mean, that seems to me an indication that we could do something here to make a difference, and he would be supportive of it. Now, I know y'all know that the Senate passed a bill repealing 1991 and 2002 just this last March, and it was bipartisan. And we voted to repeal the 2002 several times in recent years, but not in this Congress. So I'm just thinking that if this committee is really serious about doing something for war powers reform and reclaiming our powers under the Article 1, that maybe we should just take up the Senate bill that's sitting over here and move forward and make some progress so we can get on to something else. So I would ask y'all, do you find it necessary to replace the 2002 AUMF, as some of my Republican colleagues have suggested, or should we just repeal it and then take these things up as they come along in a more appropriate and relevant way?
We don't see the need to replace the 2002 AUMF, Congresswoman Titus.
Will you just elaborate on that a little bit? And you probably already have, and I missed it. I'm sorry, but that would be helpful.
So just to say that obviously our relationship with Iraq has greatly evolved since the 2002 AUMF. We are now partners with Iraq in fighting terrorists, and we work intensively together. And our relationship is obviously about much more than security. It's about energy independence, combating climate change, economic renewal, all of those kinds of things, being a good neighbor in the region. So those circumstances have changed dramatically.
And that brings me to my next point, that the president has also said that we can't afford to remain tethered to the old ways or the old policies. We need to keep current with what is actually happening in the rest of the world, because the security landscape has evolved, to use your word. And our Constitution demands that Congress shapes our response to threats, especially when we're sending force. Would you say the threats that we face today are different from the threats that we faced 2 years ago, 4 years ago, however long? And how do we keep that relevant? Should we have reports back to the Congress, because that's been pretty lacking in the past, of why we need the authorization, how it's being used, so that we kind of stay on top of it on a regular basis?
I'm going to hand to Chris in a minute for more detail, but obviously the threat is evolving significantly. We talked about al-Qaeda at its nadir. We also talked about the increasing threat from affiliated groups in the Sahel, and particularly with the political instability that we've seen, and we don't know how that is going to evolve going forward. We're doing our best diplomatically to try to restore democratic governance in some of those countries. But this is one of the reasons why one of the options that we've proposed here is that the president could be asked to certify on a regular basis what groups need to be covered, et cetera. That's one option available to you all as you think about how to maintain the freshness of this authorization.
Thank you. Before you go, when you said affiliated groups, how do you define affiliated groups? What does it, do we have some certainty about what would be considered affiliated and not, or is it just I know it when I see it?
Well, obviously, if they get support in the financial sense, in the military sense, in the training sense, from ISIS or al-Qaeda in other parts of the world, that would make them an affiliated group.
Africa?
In Africa, and some of those groups do receive support. But again, Assistant Secretary Maier, who does this all day, every day, can give you more detail.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, I think your two questions fit very well together. The dynamic nature of the threat is, especially in the context of al-Qaeda and ISIS, really one of these groups diversifying and spreading to new places and reinventing themselves. So as we talk about affiliates or associated forces, a lot of that is them looking to move to places where there's less pressure on them, like in Africa. Mm-hmm. And so I think what we would like to see in working with the Congress in as consultative a process as possible is a reflection of a mechanism that reflects that dynamic nature of this threat over time, ma'am.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Delay yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Kim.
Thank you, Chairman McCaul and Ranking Member Mix, for holding today's hearing. Sorry, on the AUMF. Excuse me. You know, since the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs became law, the national security landscape has changed. And this has led to calls to reform or repeal the AUMFs. And I believe it is important that as Congress has this discussion, that we carefully consider the fact that while the landscape may look different, the threats of terrorism to our national security still exist. Congress must increase oversight of the use of military force, but it must be also careful not to eliminate the ability of the president to confront these threats before an attack on the U.S. homeland or our personnel abroad. as a member of the subcommittee on Africa, I am interested in how AUMF reform will affect our response to the terrorism in the Sahel, where the terrorist groups are proliferating. Sub-Saharan Africa accounted for 60% of all terrorism deaths last year. And the Sahel was the site of 43% of all terrorism deaths, which is this is up from 1% in 2007. ISIS is present in the Sahel, and Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali all recently had coups. I'm deeply concerned that the destabilization in the region is further empowering ISIS. And as the U.S. loses security partners in the region to coup, we need to ensure that AUMF reform accommodates our military's ability to respond to terrorism threats in sub-Saharan Africa. So I want to ask you, what are the key terrorist organizations in Africa and which are currently covered by the 2001 AUMF?
So thank you for that question. Very much agree with you, and I think the all indications point to these groups looking to exploit insecurity in Africa, especially West Africa, and you highlighted the number of coups that are very disturbing to us. I would also add to that instability, the onset of Wagner, the Russian private military contractor, looking to exploit some of that, and some of these groups, some of these countries relying on that group. So I think the short answer, ma'am, is that both ISIS and Al-Qaeda are covered under the AUMF, and they both have affiliates or associated forces operating there. We tend to think of ISIS as being more comprehensive, and so when we think of ISIS operating there, it has different groups, ISIS West Africa.
Just quickly, do you agree that a new AUMF must cover or continue to cover those groups?
Yes, ma'am, we do.
Are there terrorist groups in Sahel that are currently not covered by the 2001 AUMF?
There are groups that we have not to date used force against using the AUMF, but I think that's a question probably best handled by our legal folks.
Let me ask one last question. How would the administration ask Congress to codify authorities to act against terrorist groups in the Sahel?
Again, I think as Assistant Secretary Maier said, the vast majority, or the ones that we have identified, are affiliates of either Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and therefore we do feel that we are covered now. As you saw, when we were able to operate in Mali and when we were able to operate in Niger, we didn't hesitate. The issue now is these coups and the difficulty of attacking this threat when these governments are not responsive to U.S. support. So we are working on that diplomatically, as you know.
Thank you. Chairman, I would like to yield the balance of my time to Congressman Mast.
Thank you, Representative. I just have one further question going back to our previous conversation. Does Dr. Tabatabai currently have a suspended position or a suspended security clearance pending further review of this situation?
No, she does not. At this point, she is working in the department.
In a capacity outside of your office?
But she's in the role she's in and that she's been hired in.
Current Chief of Staff for you?
She's current Chief of Staff, yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification. I yield back.
Gentleman yields, gentlelady yields, and Mr. Phillips is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and both to you and Ranking Member Meeks. Thank you for leading this committee in such a thoughtful, principled, and effective manner at a time where we need more of that in this institution. And I think our founders anticipated very discussions like the one we're having today when they laid out Article 1 and Article 2, some thoughtful tension between the two, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and also for your time spent with us over the last few weeks. Starting with you, Secretary Nuland, I've heard from many administration officials that the AUMF is a helpful tool, but not necessarily a requisite tool to carry out the work about which we're speaking today. Do you share that assertion?
Congressman Phillips, as we have said, when the executive branch and the Congress speak together, we are at our strongest. So we very much want to update this AUMF.
No,
and
I
send
understand that,
signal.
and you've said it many times, but my question's a little bit more distinct. Is it a helpful tool that would be nice to have, or is it a mandatory tool, in your estimation, necessary to have?
Again, I think it would depend on the circumstance that you were in, and I want to defer to Councilor Visek on the specifics, whether there are circumstances that are covered by the AUMF where we could not act without it.
Yeah, if you could
but-
lay out very specifically what authorities may not be included under Article 2 that you would require, detention, for example, others, I'd like to hear. Yep.
Thank you. It's an excellent question, Congressman. I think what the question gets at is the interplay between the AUMF and Article 2. And when do we use Article 2? And what's the utility of an AUMF? As Ms. Krass earlier noted, with respect to Article 2, we typically, does it serve would an operation serve an important national interest? And then also, because of its duration, scope, and nature, and as well as any anticipated response, would that military action sort of implicate the declare war clause of the Constitution? And so what I think that is getting at is we tend to use Article 2 for defensive, episodic sort of responses. When we're looking at a more prolonged authority that is needed, we have a foreseeable, enduring need. It's very important, I think, to have a statutory authorization.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is there is a need. Is that a fair? Okay. My time is limited, so I'd like to continue on to Mr. Maier and Ms. Krass. You wrote in your testimony that a sunset would be, quote, a major obstacle to providing the legal, strategic, and policy certainty needed to fulfill the nation's counterterrorism missions, end quote. You know, I know President Obama, in his letter to Congress in February of 2015, asked for a 3-year sunset, So I'm just curious if you disagree with him, and is that congruent with your message today?
So I think, Congressman, we continue to consistently point to a time-based sunset clause as being challenging as we try to both maintain a large coalition and clearly articulate to our adversaries that they're not going to be able to wait us out, sir.
And if I could just add, it's important to us to have uninterrupted authority for our detention activities. Back to your point, sir, that is one of the important functions that the 2001 AUMF is currently fulfilling in terms of all of our law warrant detainees are covered by the AUMF.
So you've both spoken to some degree about alternatives to a sunset. Can you just articulate clearly and somewhat quickly, if you can, just what that looks like so our committee can better understand that? And as I've said privately, I think no sunset is a non-starter, I think, for this, for the U.S. Congress, but we should have that conversation. I'd like to hear your perspective. If you could just take 20 seconds, someone answer it.
Yep.
Thanks.
Just to say a number of the things we've put on the table
Yep.
here, regular reviews by the President and Congress at set intervals as to whether it's still needed would be one option, reporting or senior level briefing requirement. Number 3 would be presidential certification to Congress at date certain that he or she still needed these authorities. Next would be expedited procedure for consideration of legislation to extend or modify, and we've engaged the staffs on both sides of the aisle in all of these ideas.
Okay, and I'll close with this. We currently have a reporting mandate every 180 days, of course. The last one we received until this last week was from June of 2021. So if this is to work, and we are to fulfill our respective constitutional responsibilities, we need to have that reporting done on a timely basis, and I would ask that you bring that back to your respective offices. Most importantly, thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Green is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. As a combat veteran who served under the authorities of both 2001 and 2002 AUMFs and a proud representative in Congress of the soldiers at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, for whom this isn't just an intellectual exercise, I'd like to thank Chairman McCaul for his leadership and for organizing this hearing today. I would also like to thank our witnesses for their time, expertise, and incredible service to the country. One of my favorite days of the year is when I host Service Academy Day. Back in the district, I It's the coolest job I have. Meeting the immensely talented young men and women who seek to attend our military service academies makes me hopeful for the future of our country. It reaffirms the importance of everything we do here, that we truly can make this grand experiment of ours a more perfect union. However, the joy and optimism of this day comes with a solemn responsibility. As members of Congress, one of our greatest enumerated powers is to oversee and authorize the use of military force, oftentimes sending the very young men and women we've nominated to service academies to the battlefield and asking them to make, unfortunately, the ultimate sacrifice at times. Under the Constitution, we swore an oath to uphold. Congress is entrusted with the burden of determining if our nation should undertake the trials and ultimate costs of the war. Congress has abdicated this duty for far too long and failed to provide the proper legal standing to our troops. I welcome the opportunity to work with my colleagues in the House to develop a path forward for AUMF authorities that respects congressional leadership on this issue, but also continues to grant our troops the authorities they need for combat operations against jihadist terrorist groups. These jihadis are the successors of the terror cells that attacked our nation on 9/11, and our operations against these groups remain critical to U.S. national security. I'm confident that there is a constitutionally appropriate solution that we can come to. I look forward to developing this solution with our witnesses here today. Question really to whomever, how important is it to ensure a seamless continuity of authority between the 2001 AUMF and any replacement to it?
It's essential, Congressman, for all the reasons we've stated here: detention, the ability to not lose an opportunity if we can and need to take a strike, but also, as Assistant Secretary Maier has underscored, maintaining the confidence of the coalition that we lead around the world, that we will stay in this fight, and so that they will stay with us in this fight and budget and act appropriately.
If the 2001 AUMF were repealed before a replacement was enacted, how would that impact or endanger our ability to legally detain the 30 al-Qaeda terrorists at Guantanamo?
We would be very concerned by an interruption in that authority, sir, and we believe that without a doubt that detainees would bring litigation over whether there continued to be authority to hold them.
Congress is likely to include a time limit in any new AUMF. I know my colleague across the aisle has said yes, no to this. There are differences of opinion, but what kinds of concerns should we look at in deciding how long that should be if there is a time limit?
Again, I think we've been pretty clear here that a set date just will embolden our enemies. Just to clarify, one of the proposals that we have put on the table in this hearing and with staff is this idea of a presidential certification that there's a continuing requirement. One way that you could work with this would be to write legislation that would lapse if the president didn't certify. That would put this back in your hands and would create that sense of comity between the executive and the Congress. So that is one option that is available to you.
I like that course of action.
Yeah.
Do you think a new counterterrorism AUMF should be global or regional? I mean, I have my opinion, but I'd be very interested to hear yours.
It's got to be global, Congressman, because of the way, as Assistant Secretary Maier said, these groups are morphing and moving to more hospitable environments.
So we've got a lot of new organizations that have entered the fight. How do we word it so that we make sure any of these new entities that get new names are also included?
We've talked about a number of mechanisms. As you know, we have not been shy about coming to you in open session or in classified session with new affiliated groups, et cetera, so we would continue to do that. You could do any of a number of things: a regular request to the administration to re-up the list, regular reporting requirement, regular consultation, regular recertification, any of those, because as you rightly point out, the groups are moving and morphing.
Thank you. My time is up. I yield.
Joan yields. Ms. Jacobs is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. You know, I represent San Diego, the biggest military community in the country, and, you know, my community has borne the cost of these decisions or lack thereof that Congress has not really been making since I was in middle school, which was when we voted on this AUMF. So first, I just want to follow up on questions from Ranking Member Meeks and my colleague, Representative Phillips, on the 1550 reporting. Assistant Secretary Maier, will you commit to providing future Section 5050 reporting by the statutory deadline?
I will, and just to hit that point, because it's come up a number of times, I'm responsible for the late submission of that report, so we have taken steps internally to ensure that we can meet that commitment to Congresswoman Jacobs.
Thank you. I appreciate that, especially since, as you all are asking for no sunset, in exchange promising more transparency, it feels hard to believe that when the transparency we already mandate isn't actually coming. And on that regard, last year at the hearing on the AUMF, my colleague, Mr. Castro, asked why the Department of Defense had classified the list of countries in which the U.S. military had used force, and you responded that you would see if aspects of the classified report could be made public. We've seen no real disclosure since then. So can you commit to actually going back and taking that look and declassifying the list of groups, including affiliates, that you consider to be covered by the 2001 AUMF?
Yes, ma'am, and actually a number of those groups are already unclassified that we can speak openly to here. In some cases, we are careful about identifying countries for purposes of diplomatic and a host of other things, but I think the vast majority of the groups are known publicly, ma'am.
Great. Well, I will look forward to not having to ask you the same question in a year. Moving on to this question of associated or affiliated forces, I think this is a key question for us in Congress and a key reason why it feels like the 2001 AUMF has gone so far beyond the original scope. You know, it was originally supposed to be about those people who perpetrated 9/11, which is why we went after al-Qaeda and the Taliban at the time. But from public reporting, from what you said today, we know that this AUMF has been used to justify force not only in Afghanistan, but in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Mali, and Niger. So I want to talk about some hypothetical cases. I know you've said the standard is enter the fight alongside a named group, co-belligerent, and the intent. So, Ms. Krass, if we could go through a couple hypothetical associated forces, and you can let me know with a yes or no answer if you would consider them covered. So, first of all, if a group did not exist in 2001, could it still constitute an associated force or otherwise be covered by the 2001 AUMF?
So thank you for that question, Congresswoman Jacobs, and I apologize that I prefer not to engage in hypotheticals. I think we can use as an example the designation of ISIS, which was a group that stems from al-Qaeda in Iraq from 2003, so that's after the 2001 AUMF. But there were ties between its leader and Osama bin Laden before 9/11. That group eventually split from al-Qaeda.
Yeah, we're familiar with the history of ISIS. I would note there are a number of groups that didn't exist in 2001 that are currently covered, al-Shabaab, for instance, and didn't have ties to Osama bin Laden prior to 2001. And what if the group itself, this affiliated or associated group, if you want to use real examples, you're welcome to, but if they don't have the ambition, intent, or capability to attack the U.S. homeland, as your own reporting that we just got this week says most of the affiliated groups don't, would that be considered covered by the 2001 AUMF?
And so a group under the AUMF has to be one which, as Assistant Secretary Maier has explained, an organized armed group which has entered the fight alongside al-Qaeda or the Taliban and is a co-belligerent.
Yep,
with
I got
al-Qaeda,
that.
the
But
Taliban,
we know that, in fact, many of the groups that you all are counting do not actually have the intent to strike the United States as per your own reporting. Next, if their aims are primarily local, meaning their grievances are specific to their community, have nothing to do with the United States, and their aim is to primarily attack in the region, would that be covered? The answer is yes. I'll answer for you. I know you don't like hypotheticals. We've seen that in the case of the elements in the Sahel and Somalia. Lastly, if the group is an affiliate of an affiliate, so ISIS is categorized because they were an affiliate, but now we're saying ISIS affiliates are also covered, would that be covered?
So again, to echo what Assistant Secretary Maier explained, we see ISIS as, we don't look at ISIS as having associated forces itself. We see it as itself being a single organized group.
And I see that for some of the groups you're counting as affiliates, but I think, for instance, ISIS Mozambique, it's very hard to say that they're part of core ISIS. So I will look forward to continuing this conversation, but I think it's clear that we have let these overly broad definitions make it so that we don't have any meaningful oversight over what you all are doing. And I think that just doing Al-Qaeda and ISIS and not the affiliated forces specifically named is really problematic. Thank you.
Generally yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Huizenga.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right here. I was actually a staffer when 9/11 happened, and worked for a gentleman who had just been named to the Intel Committee, who actually ended up chairing the Intel Committee, Peter Hoekstra. And I remember the robust debates, shall we call them, that surrounded what we were going to do as a country. And much like my friend, the birthday boy, Mr. Meeks, had said, I don't think anybody imagined that 22 years later we'd be operating in the same manner. And nor did, and I don't want to speak for him, I'll speak for myself, but nor did we think that Congress wouldn't have, at a minimum, periodic involvement in reviewing this. And that seems like where we are today, where we're asking, or you're asking, for that not to be part of this. And I would like to know, and probably going to be to you, Undersecretary, what does this administration believe what Congress's role is in this, in determining which groups are covered by an AUMF? I understand you don't like the timeline, and I understand the thinking and the reasoning why, but what's your take on us being involved in the who we're actually fighting?
Congressman Huizenga, I think we would welcome a stronger partnership between the executive and the Congress in the new legislation in terms of how we determine the groups and how we report the groups. So as we have said earlier in this hearing, there are many ways that we could create a mechanism where we would come to you on whatever basis you want, every 2 years, every longer, to specify more clearly the groups that we think are covered. What I would say, though, as you know, in the current circumstance, we do some of this in the open, particularly with groups that we've already acted against, but we do need to maintain a classified ability with those groups that we may need to go after.
Real quickly, does the administration oppose or support providing Congress with the opportunity to review counterterrorism-related deployments of troops?
That's going to go to the scope of the,
Yeah, Congressman, I think we already do that. We provide regular updates to the Armed Services Committee on those exact things.
You had discussed, and my friend from Tennessee, Congressman Green, had thought he was intrigued by this some type of certification by the president. What I think maybe I would be more interested in is not just having a certification by the president, but a congressional review of said certification, meaning Congress would have to approve that need for a certification. And now that might be problematic with your date concerns, but I'm not willing to give up the constitutional obligation and standing that we have on oversight and our involvement in what that is going on. So I don't know, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, you know, if we can work through some of that type of language, I'd like that to be a part of it. My remaining minute and a half, I would like to know, moving to Afghanistan, has anyone at the Department of State or the Department of Defense had conversations with Taliban leaders regarding its lack of inclusion in a future AUMF?
I don't believe so, sir. our conversations with the Taliban are extremely constrained and go primarily to.
So I'm not talking on necessarily official channels.
Yeah.
I mean, has there been any of that conversation?
To my knowledge, no.
Okay. Mr. Mayor?
No, I'm not aware of any of conversations that ilk either.
Okay. Does the administration oppose listing the Taliban on an AUMF, or is there a fear that somehow that would be angering them or set off the relationship?
Congressman, we have been pretty clear that we do think they're making steady progress against ISIS-K. We can talk about that in a separate session, and we do think that al-Qaeda is greatly attrited at the current
My
moment.
question is, does the administration oppose listing the Taliban on the AUMF?
We do not think it's necessary. We think we have the authorities to act, including
right.
what we showed with Zawahiri.
Okay. Well, I'll finish on this with my friend Andy Barr's concerns. He has people that were at HKIA. I actually have a constituent who is injured at Abbey Gate. I have in the past referred to him as Jose because I have not wanted to get his name out publicly. And I can tell you that he and his family, as he has been recovering from this, they do not feel confident that the Taliban has made the proper progress that is being claimed here. And that is going to be an ongoing concern for us and should be. And with that, my time is.
Neil raises an interesting point. If we had a presidential certification and Congress either approves and it moves forward, if we disapprove, that could trigger the sunset clause. That may be a possible solution. And I know, but if you get back to me on that particular mechanism, that would be interesting.
In
Ms.
fact,
Dean,
I was just passed a note from folks who've been working on this with your staff. That's another way to go.
Gotcha. Ms. Dean is recognized.
I thank you, Chairman McCaul and Ranking Member Meeks, for holding this important hearing. I thank all of you, our witnesses, for testifying today, but more importantly for your work on behalf of our nation. I want to do a little look back so I understand. I was not here when the 2001 AUMF was signed, passed. So a little history and then looking forward. One of the things I'm interested in is maybe legal counsel can tell me, how was the 2001 AUMF, how was it so broadly interpreted as to allow for a full occupation and nation-building attempts in Afghanistan? And I say that with great respect for what our troops did there, but what do we learn from that broad use of the 2001 AUMF? And how do we structure a future AUMF to preclude such activities unless congressionally authorized?
Maybe I'll start that and then turn to my colleague, Assistant Secretary Maier. The language of the 2001 AUMF, as with other similar AUMFs, is broad in that it authorizes the president to use all necessary and appropriate force to counter the threat, which was determined to be the threat from al-Qaeda and the Taliban and associated forces. And so various presidents exercised their authority consistent with that authorization to take the actions that they took in Afghanistan.
Where down that road should we have constricted this? That the language was so broad, if we craft one better, how do we constrict it so that doesn't go forward without congressional approval?
I think one means to ensure regular interactions between the executive branch and Congress are reporting mechanisms and consultation requirements.
Did you want to add anything historically?
The only thing I would say, Congresswoman, is one of the things that has evolved over time is a lot of statutory requirements to update the Congress on ongoing operations. I think we have used that as a mechanism to both inform, but at some level continue to move forward, understanding that there wasn't legislation that prevented us from doing that, ma'am.
Okay, and looking forward, I know a lot of us have talked about sunset, or a lot of people here, and I apologize, we are in and out of this room because of conflicts, not because we don't know this is terribly important. So if I'm repeating something, let me know. Assistant Secretary Maier, you testified that a sunset provision would, quote, add strategic and operational risk to our counterterrorism efforts, and potentially undermine our international partnerships. In a little more plain English, what's that mean?
I think in as plain of English as I can give you, Congresswoman, it means that if our partners start to see us backing away from our ongoing commitment, we are the global leader, they will do the same. And one of the things that we have had as a benefit, especially in the Defeat ISIS coalition, is a lot of small countries looking around, seeing each other, continuing to be involved and pass, in some cases, challenging political mandates in their own systems, but they see the United States as the leader and the sustainable leader for that.
And just to add to that, thank you. The potential for the terrorists to wait us out. If they know in 3 years the authorities expire, they're going to go to ground and get ready for that moment in 3 years, and then the detention authorities as well.
I hear so many echoes of what our concerns are if we show weakening support for Ukraine. If others around the world think they can wait us out and just grind down this war, that level of uncertainty is globally so disastrous. We must stand with the folks in Ukraine. Ambassador, you talked about this sort of hybrid approach, which would be not quite a sunset, but a lapse unless presidential certification takes place. What does presidential certification look like? Just to build on what you were all talking about.
So obviously this is something that we need to discuss and work through, but a number of ideas here. At regular intervals that you all would set in the law of 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, the president would have to come forward and say, I believe the nation still needs these authorities. It could either be all the authorities or some of the authorities as necessary. There could be any number of, you all would have to disapprove that. If you didn't want to grant them, that would be one way to go, so that there would be a regular conversation and you would have to engage as to whether you supported the certification or not. That's one idea, and the one that the chairman just recently grabbed onto. So,
again, I thank you all for your work, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Generally yields. Mr. Hill is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Appreciate you holding this important hearing. I was saying to my colleagues, it's nice to be in a hearing room today working on something extremely important to the country, and so thank you for calling this hearing. And a happy birthday to Greg Meeks, the most energetic 70-year-old guy from Queens that I know personally, who knew Cassius Clay. You can't beat that. So this has been a good discussion, but I want to explore, continue to explore this discussion. Thank the panel for being here. Ms. Krass, Mr. Maier, you said in your testimony that you don't believe it's necessary to add Iran-aligned militia groups to a new or upgraded AUMF, partly because, and this is a point I'm not sure has been made, that 2022 National Security Strategy prioritizes China and Russia as the primary strategic threats to the U.S. Is that really the reason why you don't suggest that Shia militia groups be included, or would you say it's the principal reason they shouldn't be included, Mr. Maier?
Congressman, I would not say that. I think we say in the National Defense Strategy that China is our pacing challenge and Russia is our acute challenge, but often forgotten is the fact that we also identify Iran, North Korea, and violent extremist organizations as also being priorities for us, sir.
Yeah. But when you think about that, who is more likely to conduct an attack inside the United States or against U.S. forces on an any day basis? One of those terror forces or a Shia militia group or the Russian Federation? Hypothetical question. I know the Undersecretary won't answer it, but I know the Assistant Secretary might, so I'm letting you take a shot at that.
I'm just going to say that it's our job to ensure that none of them take
I
the strike.
I agree, but it's a difference between, what we're dealing with in great power rivalry versus people who have a much lower cost potential of taking a shot at the United States or U.S. interests, and we've seen that consistently since the 1950s, most, predominantly, I think about every day since it's October. October to me means 1983, which means the loss of our Marines in Beirut. And so I want to get this right. The Shia militia groups, who besides the Shia militia groups are active in Syria, in Assad's Syria, aiding the Assad regime? Who on your list?
So I think some of that goes into a session we can't talk to.
But are the
protect it.
Shia militia active in open source? Are they active in backing the Assad regime?
Iran definitely used proxies to project its power in Syria, sir, yes.
And they've attacked Americans operating in Syria?
They have.
And they've attacked other allied partners with the United States in Syria?
They have.
What is your view of the risk of Shia militia becoming more active and more ingratiated, I would say, and having legal standing now in the country of Iraq? Is that a risk to expanded Shia militia activity against forces connected with the United States?
I'm going to, in this open session, just say that we are working intensively with the Iraqi government and with our security partnership that we have there to ensure that Iraq cannot be used as a projection point for Iranian militias. I will just leave it there, and then just to remind of the strike that the president authorized in Syria in March, under which was primarily designed to restore deterrence.
And in Afghanistan, when was the last time we conducted a strike in Afghanistan related to your authorities under the AUMF?
The Zawahiri strike in 2022.
So that was in July of 2022?
Correct.
Has there not been any rationale, you think, for a strike since then against the, in the country of Afghanistan?
Congressman Hill, I think it would be useful to get you a briefing in another session with regard to other work that has been ongoing in Afghanistan, if that makes sense.
That's good. Well, I've had those briefings, but thank you. Ms. Krass, help me understand the legal limitations of using the President's Article II authority that you referenced in your testimony versus an AUMF from Congress.
So the President's Article II power is constrained in two ways. One, he has to determine that the use of force serves an important national interest, and two, that use of force and any response that's likely from whomever the force is being used against would not escalate into war in the constitutional sense in terms of its nature, scope, or duration.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Stanton.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Last year at a hearing on the 2001 AUMF, administration officials opposed adding a sunset provision to the 2001 AUMF or including a sunset provision in any replacement legislation. As an alternative, they proposed conducting periodic reviews with Congress of the list of so-called, quote, associated forces, unquote. I know it's a topic that's been covered, but I want to cover it a little bit more. This is a question for Assistant Secretary Maier. Given that the executive branch has habitually delayed complying with the War Powers reporting requirements, how can Congress meaningfully participate in a periodic review of the AUMF?
So, Congressman, I think some of the ways that we have highlighted that would go above and beyond reporting requirements, such as a presidential certification and more active engagement as opposed to simply a report, would be some options to, if you would, upgrade perhaps some of that engagement, sir.
All right. In order for Congress to participate, obviously there has to be full compliance with the reporting requirements. If Congress wanted to delist a group, how could Congress ensure that its decisions during a periodic review to delist a group would be legally binding?
I mean, as we've talked about, one option could be that the President would need to certify to you that he needs the authorities to continue, or he needs them to continue over some or all of the statute, and then you could approve that or respond to that by rejecting some aspects of the presidential request. That's another way to go.
Your thought is that it would not require an actual act of Congress to pass a new bill subject to presidential veto to delist a group?
It might. I'm going to stop pretending to be a lawyer here and let Visek do the work.
Fair enough. All right.
No,
please.
It's an interesting question, and one that would depend on the wording, obviously, and what the procedure is. I mean, obviously, we're mindful of the bicameralism and the presentment requirements. But I think the idea, however, is to engage with Congress. The certification could be used as a mechanism to say, yes, there is this continuing need and then to build in procedures for Congress to express its views, whether by passing a law or by traditional oversight and reporting. You know, obviously Congress always has the ability to pass a law. But I think what we're communicating is we are open to structuring as many ways as possible and as legal to increase engagement with Congress, because I think it's been said previously, when Congress and the President are on the same page, it sends the most powerful signal.
Ms. Krass, according to the administration, the 2001 AUMF allows hostilities with al-Qaeda and the Taliban's associated forces, but we know the Department of Defense has used the 2001 AUMF to pursue the Islamic State of Libya, the Islamic State Sinai Province, the Islamic State Yemen Province, among others. These groups are affiliates of ISIS, not al-Qaeda, and many of them are actually in conflict with regional al-Qaeda affiliates. How far removed can a, quote, associated force, unquote, be from al-Qaeda and the Taliban under the 2001 AUMF?
Thank you, Congressman. The administration, the Obama administration in 2014 determined that ISIS qualified as an associated force of al-Qaeda because ISIS is the successor to al-Qaeda in Iraq, and its leadership was closely aligned with Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, and declared their allegiance to al-Qaeda. They subsequently split off, but we can't allow our adversaries and these terrorist groups to determine whether they're covered by the AUMF by what they name themselves and who they align with.
I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Davidson's recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. I echo the sentiments of many colleagues. This is an incredibly important hearing and frankly one that's long overdue, but I'm grateful to have it today. Serving in the 75th Ranger Regiment, one of my soldiers who had been in combat in Mogadishu, Somalia, asked me whether he had done the right thing in a tough situation. He did, but he wanted my opinion on why America had asked such incredible things of him and then pulled out. If we weren't committed to the victory, why did we even go? And if we were committed to victory, what did we actually achieve? In the wake of 9/11, we saw President Bush fly a, quote, mission accomplished banner on the deck of a United States aircraft carrier. Everyone in the world knew that was a false claim and called him out on it. Few knew, but some suspected that an endless war was lying ahead. The Constitution reserves the declaration of war for Congress for a reason. When America is at war, its people must support the cause. Even when an all-volunteer force wages the wars, the American people are credited or blamed for victory or defeat and left with the tab. It is vitally important that this body, this Congress, closest to the people, make the commitments to put America at war. Any other standard risks empowering a permanent police state, and for that reason, every single Congress must actively make that commitment, not an open checkbook for an unlimited duration. That is not acceptable, and it can't continue. Now, to be clear, terrorists, transnational criminal organizations, and nation states who are actively preparing to harm the United States, Americans, or our allies should know that there will be no sanctuary for them anywhere. And in my view, we should address them all in an effective AUMF. It seems the administration wants to selectively apply that principle, both in identifying and targeting enemies of our country and in whether to name them in an AUMF, whether in public or in a classified setting. And they want to claim Article 2 has nearly unlimited and uncheckable application in nearly every situation, whether that's intelligence collection or active combat. To reclaim Article 1 constitutional authority on this matter, Congress must end the status quo with a focused AUMF and separately with reforms to the Patriot Act and termination of Executive Order 12333. Mr. Visek, how is an authorization for use of military force different than a declaration of war?
Well, I think the authorization to use military force, I mean, I think it serves sort of three important functions. You know, and here where we're talking about non-state actors, I think traditionally we think of a declaration of war as, you know,
focused on a nation state.
Focused on nation states. But I think they both serve the same purpose in that they're authorizing sort of prolonged military activities, you know, where there's a continuing threat to the United States. And I think, as I've said, or U.S. interests. I think previously, in response to other questions, both Ms. Krass and I have noted that Article 2 it authorizes activities short of war, and we tend to use in sort of episodic defensive response modes.
Right, it's reactive. So how important is authorization for our actions on the battlefield or detention of enemy combatants?
Well, I think as my DOD and colleagues and Deputy Secretary Nuland have said, I think it's very important to have continuity in our authorities. And so in AUMF, by virtue of the fact that it is sort of an authority that can is enduring, if you will, until it's obviously modified or adjusted, is critical to maintaining authorities for detention, and also for, you know, operational purposes, and also the non-legal but the very probably equally important policy aspects of showing a commitment to our allies and also telling our adversaries that we're in it for the long
because
run.
I won't have time for an answer, I'd ask to get a written response to this question. In the past, AUMFs have led to large and enduring presence of boots on the ground, some would say occupation. In the Middle East, it has led to regime change wars against nation states and subsequent largely unproductive nation-building efforts. What is considered an occupation, and what are limiting factors, whether it's size, location, and duration? And I think we need to address that in the AUMF. So your feedback would be greatly helpful, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Chairman, and happy birthday to our Ranking Member Meeks and many more. Thank you to Mr. Visek. Can you explain the process whereby the administration determines which and what entities qualify as associate forces, and who's at the table to make this decision?
Well, I think determinations are made sort of at the most senior levels of the U.S. government. It's an interagency process after careful evaluation of the intelligence. The associated forces is a two-part test. And I think, you know, first, the entity has to be an organized armed group that has entered the fight alongside al-Qaeda. Previously was also the Taliban, but I think the focus here is really al-Qaeda. Second, it's not just that they have, you know, entered a fight alongside al-Qaeda. The group must be a co-belligerent with al-Qaeda in hostilities against the United States or our coalition partners. And I think this has been an important sort of test for us because, as has been noted, groups can splinter, they can morph, they can rebrand, and we have to have some flexibility to be able to adjust. Now, in the 2001 AUMF, it's been the Associated Forces test. I think that would be a familiar model and one that's been recognized by you know, Congress and the judiciary and obviously the executive branch as, you know, a model that could be used going forward. We would, of course, always be open to, you know, other ways to provide flexibility in terms of
If I could ask a follow-up question on that, how do you determine the scope, the nature, the duration of which we'll have these engagements going forward?
Well, I think at this point I'd like to turn to Assistant Secretary Maier, because I think this is a predictive exercise that really involves sort of an intelligence and military assessments, as well as sort of the expertise of policy officials at the State Department.
So, Congressman, I think it's a multi-pronged consideration. So when we look at what is going to be necessary in the context of military force, we're really applying a series of tests. But I think in most simply and in the plainest English, we're trying to mitigate the threat within the means that we have. So that is not always exclusively military force, of course. We use a variety of other instruments. But I think from a Department of Defense perspective, we're looking to do this as effectively and efficiently as possible.
In light of the administration withdrawing from Afghanistan, what is the process? Are there any people or any groups that have come off of our watch list as a result of the shift in the policy in Afghanistan?
Congressman, we have not taken anybody off the AUMF associated forces list. As to watch listing, if that's what you're also getting at, I think that's probably better handled in a different session, sir.
Thank you. And probably the last question is, only a handful of members were able to sign this AUMF, and most of them are gone now. And this is a key responsibility, a core responsibility for why we got elected to be a part of this. What would you say, recommend on, that could give us some comfort on why we're here and what we can do to help better assist in your service?
Well, Congressman Jackson, I think that's exactly why we're here, that we would welcome a re-upping of appropriate authorities through a new AUMF and discussing what needs to be there together. And that's, I think, why we've been going through all of this today. So, because we want members like you to be part of the next chapter of this fight against terror.
Thank you, Victoria. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Baird's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and the ranking member for holding this important discussion, and happy birthday, ranking member. We appreciate, also we appreciate all of our witnesses being here today, but my area focuses on terrorism is exploding in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa accounted for 60% of all terrorism deaths last year. AFRICOM describes al-Shabaab as al-Qaeda's largest and best financed affiliate, with annual revenues around $150 million. So despite robust U.S. and African Union missions to degrade the group, DOD reports that al-Shabaab poses a high terrorist threat to the U.S. interest in Somalia, and even a weak to moderate threat to the U.S. homeland. So is it important that al-Shabaab be covered by any new AUMF? And
absolutely.
Took care of that question, didn't you? So anyway. But under the 2001 AUMF, al-Shabaab has been targeted as an associated force of al-Qaeda. And in a new AUMF, should al-Shabaab be listed as a targetable group rather than just an affiliated or associated force of al-Qaeda? And why or why not?
So I'm going to let Assistant Secretary Maier elaborate, but al-Shabaab started as an affiliate of al-Qaeda. It still works with al-Qaeda. That wouldn't preclude them being listed separately if that's what the Congress wanted to do, but under the current AUMF, that's how we think about them.
Really, Congressman, nothing to add other than the fact that the reason we would keep al-Qaeda and al-Shabaab together is because al-Shabaab's largely speaking on behalf of al-Qaeda and using their ideology to really be the impetus for why they would threaten Americans. So there's a lineage there, sir.
Anyone else? Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Crow is recognized. No, that's not correct. Ms. Kamlager Dev.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ranking Member Meeks. Happy birthday to you as well. I want to thank the witnesses who are here. I know it is rare to have you here, and I have questions. But before I get to them, I do just kind of want to reconnect us to reality for a moment. We're on the verge of a congressional shutdown, and I hear members demanding a more aggressive stance against malign actors and posturing a more defiant defense of democracy around the globe. But when Congress shuts down the government, half of the Pentagon's civilian employees will be furloughed. In the event of a national defense crisis, new contracts will not be awarded. Payments to defense contractors would be delayed. Foreign aid programs supporting our allies would dry up. Members of military would be expected to maintain operations and posts without pay. State Department employees and consular operations would only continue for as long as there's funding. And in fact, later on today, we'll be voting on amendments that would compromise and cut critical programs that support our national security and diplomacy. So I don't want us to compartmentalize reality here. But now for my questions, and so grateful that the member before me asked about al-Shabaab, because Africa is now the epicenter of international terrorism, with total terrorism-related fatalities rising by nearly 50% since 21 to 22. And this is while the United States has had a counterterrorism presence on the continent for over 15 years. The international community has seen the destabilizing impacts of this violence and the flawed counterterrorism policies meant to address it. So, Assistant Secretary Maier, U.S. forces have been engaged in Somalia against al-Shabaab since 2017. Yet aside from some momentum in 2012, we have not seen Somali and international forces decisively turn the tide against al-Shabaab. So looking back over the past 15 years, why do you believe we haven't been more successful in Somalia? And please cover shortcomings in the U.S. government response as well as any structural obstacles.
So, Congresswoman, I think this is a multi-pronged question and a multi-pronged answer. I'll try to be very brief in saying that our ability to operate unilaterally, the U.S. government, only can deal with some of this problem. Many of the conditions in Somalia are a function of poor governance, and until really recently, and by that I mean in the last year or so, we haven't seen the Somali government really take the fight to al-Shabaab the way we'd like. I think with President Hassan Sheikh, we've seen that, so we have a partner there that is much stronger. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the decision at the end of the last administration to pull all U.S. forces out of Somalia and then have our forces commuting to work in a less than ideal circumstance certainly had impact operationally on our ability to get after the al-Shabaab threats.
Okay, thank you for that. And following up on that question, Undersecretary Nuland, even if we're making significant gains, many experts have advised that sustaining those over the long term would require restabilization and rehabilitation efforts, a local security presence, addressing clan divisions, and standing up government services. Yet we've sort of mainly allocated military resources. So given this discrepancy, what is your view of our end goal in Somalia? And what are the means that we need to achieve it?
First, Congresswoman Kamlager, Doug, thank you on behalf of the men and women of the State Department and DOD for noting how deleterious a shutdown would be for government operations and all that we do around the world. Just to say in Somalia, and to echo what Assistant Secretary Maier said, we now have a government in Somalia that's taking the fight to al-Shabaab. We work with them in every way in terms of mentoring, going along with them, et cetera, but we are also providing significant support to them on the economic side where we can, on the humanitarian side where we can, thanks to the generosity of the Congress, in helping to rehabilitate communities when they are cleared of al-Shabaab. It is difficult, but the Somalia we seek is obviously one that is democratic, at peace, and free of terror.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Light yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually had some other things I wanted to talk about today, but Mr. Chairman, it's just brought to my attention. Ms. Nuland, you said earlier in this hearing, I quote, "I don't believe we've seen a consistent pattern of those Afghans who worked and supported our efforts." And this was in response to a question about SIVs and, by extension, commandos and others who stood and fought with us. "I don't believe we've seen a consistent pattern of those Afghans who worked and supported our efforts in Afghanistan being murdered by the Taliban," end quote, from earlier in this hearing. Ms. Nuland, I'll be candid with you. That is one of the most ignorant and shameful statements I have heard in this Congress. But let me just take a moment and tell you what's happening in the real world outside of the cubicles and the bureaucracy and in the State Department. One of the SIVs I successfully got out, his cousin was just drugged through his village behind a Taliban truck to death to send a message about ever working with Americans again. His brother was beaten to an inch of his life just long enough so that he could call the SIV that's now in the United States and tell him what happened before they killed him. I just talked to another SIV that we got out. The Taliban kidnapped his 10-year-old nephew, had his nephew call him here and say, you come back to face Taliban justice or the 10-year-old boy will. I can keep going. I just had an Uber driver last night that said the Taliban just visited his house for the 5th time looking for him and has now kidnapped one of his relatives until he comes out. He's put the rest of his family in hiding. I can put you in touch with veterans groups. One gentleman I just spoke with exhausted his entire savings and his kid's 529 plan, still having people in hiding 2 years later doing your job. I can go on, but Mr. Chairman, for the record, I'd like to enter in just 3 from a quick Google search. Human Rights Watch, no end to Taliban revenge killings in Afghanistan. I'd like to enter that for the record.
Without objection,
dated
so
August
ordered.
2023. Amnesty International, at least 237 extrajudicial executions from the Taliban takeover until June of last year.
Without objection, so ordered.
The UN, UNAMA, UN News, Afghanistan's Taliban responsible for revenge killings, torture of former officials. I can go on.
Without objection, so ordered.
Ms. Nuland, I don't know how you and Secretary Blinken look yourselves in the mirror. I don't know how you collect a paycheck in good conscience. But I can tell you what, I and others on this committee and other veterans who are out there watching you guys pat yourselves on the back as we have a spike in veteran suicide, I will not quit for those Gold Star families until you all are held accountable. When you make statements like that, it only reinforces why I get up in the morning to come and hold this position the American people have elected me to. Let me switch very quickly. We mentioned 2 cartels. There's 2 tests, right? It's international interest and it won't escalate to war. We've had hundreds of thousands. We've had more people killed in the United States from the poison these cartels are pumping over the border than we lost in every major war since World War II. So I'll open it up to the panel, but Assistant Secretary Maier, I'll go with you first. Is it in our national interest to prevent the deaths of 100,000 Americans a year?
Yeah, Congressman Waltz, absolutely, and I think the fentanyl challenge, the other opioid challenges are really something that this also falls in my portfolio. We're focused on all the time. I think the one nuance I would give you is I'm not sure that military force in every instance is the right tool. As we
So we all remember in the 90s, we were using legal authorities to try to run around the world and arrest al-Qaeda, right? Whether that was in Africa or elsewhere. It wasn't until 3,000 Americans were killed on 9/11, this body and the president at the time decided it was a national security issue that warranted military force. Mr. Chairman, we are losing far more than that every day. These cartels, if we change the name tomorrow from Sinaloa and Jalisco to ISIS and al-Qaeda, it wouldn't even be a debate on what action that we have to take, and I will certainly support that in this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Crow is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to all of you for coming in today and for your professional testimony and your work. You know, I do want to address, though, I think a fundamental misunderstanding and something that we haven't really dove into, and that is just the real meaning behind this relationship, the relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And there have been some phrases that have been used consistently today, comments like, we want to have a stronger partnership, comments like, you know, there has to be periodic reviews, and only in the absence of periodic reviews does Congress then come in and exercise its constitutional obligations. Comments like we want to make Congress a stronger part of the next chapter of terrorism, counterterrorism. I think all of those fundamentally misunderstand the issue here. 22 years, $3 trillion by most estimations, thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of non-American lives. I fought the war 3 times, was on a special operations task force, conducted direct action missions against many of these entities we're talking about here today. But Congress has to make the decision. Congress is in charge. There is no partnership. We make the decision. We take the vote. And when there's a situation regarding sunset provisions, we've talked a lot about sunset provisions, and the refrain over and over again is, if we forecast to our partners that there's a sunset, maybe they'll back away. Maybe they'll lose resolve. That's kind of the point. If they're a partner and they're willing to back away only if we're engaged, or if they're willing to lose their resolve if we actually don't have a debate, then maybe they're not a good partner. Then maybe we should back away. That is the debate that has to happen in this body before the American people. And that's the debate that hasn't happened the last 2 decades. That is the point. So I'm not afraid of those debates. And I'm not afraid of putting a sunset provision in there to actually have a discussion about maybe we shouldn't be in some of these places. Maybe after 20 years and hundreds of billions of dollars in Afghanistan, we should have had a discussion earlier about their lack of resolve and the nature of their partnership. So I think that is really the debate here. And for my part, I will not vote for anything that doesn't put an affirmative obligation on the United States Congress to cast a vote to use force, period. There's no certification in my view. There's no the president has to act or not act, and then Congress steps in later. That is not the way the Constitution works, and if history has shown anything, that is a failed policy. It has failed because it won't force a discussion on the nature of our partners and allies, and it won't hold them accountable, too, for their own destiny. It has failed because we're not actually having a discussion about what success looks like. Right? Over and over again, presidents, regardless of political affiliation, define success as there's been no attacks on the homeland. Yeah, that is a success. I agree with that. But also look at the other elements of success, because if that is our definition of success, and that is our only definition of success, then we will be locked into this in perpetuity. It will go on forever. Because forever, we will have to be doing this to prevent an attack on the homeland. Another element of success has to be, what is the geographic scope of these entities? Are they growing? Are they metastasizing? Because by that definition of success, we are failing. We are actually failing. And we have to have a debate about what other elements of our national policies and our national security that we need to bring to bear, humanitarian, diplomatic, governance, that we are not bringing to bear in appropriate ratios to achieve that other definition of success. We are locked into a perpetual conflict that, unless we are very serious and have the debate in this body, will go on forever. So, I'm sorry, I had some questions. I will submit those for the record. But I think it's just really important that we level set about what this is really about. And I am not afraid of having the discussion, a honest discussion about what we shouldn't and shouldn't be doing. And we should not, as a country, shy away from that. And if our partners are afraid of that, if they waver because we want to have that debate, then good riddance to them. Maybe they shouldn't be a partner. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Lawler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sanctions should be tied to behavioral change. But under the recent Iranian hostage deal, the Biden administration waived certain sanctions to facilitate the transfer of $6 billion in frozen Iranian funds to accounts in Qatar despite Iran's ongoing malign activity. Ms. Nuland, what message does this send regarding U.S. sanctions policies?
Congressman, thank you. Just to remind and to be very clear, no American taxpayer dollars went to Iran to get our 5 American citizens and 2 family members home. This was money that was Iran's to begin with, that was frozen at our request by our allies and partners so that it could
Frozen why?
frozen because of our concern about their malign activity.
Right. So what has
including
changed?
detention.
What has changed about their malign activity since this administration chose to unfreeze $6 billion in Iranian assets that were sanctioned?
One aspect of what has changed is they have been willing to release these 7 people after extensive negotiation.
Did we not trade hostages for hostages?
Again, let me just also remind, if I may.
Did we not trade hostages for hostages?
I'm not sure what you're.
Did we not give hostages?
We did, of course we
Okay.
did. Yeah.
So not only did we
They
trade
were not
hostages,
Our people
not
were
only
hostages.
not only did we trade hostages, we then did what? We gave $6 billion to the biggest state sponsor of terrorism. And you know what was insulting? That this administration informed Congress on September 11th, the worst terrorist attack in the history of our nation. That's the day that this administration chose to inform Congress officially?
Congressman, let me just clarify one thing here, first of all. The people that we got home were wrongfully detained in Iran. The people that we ultimately released had been charged and convicted in American courts. We made that decision.
Right. So on top of that, we gave,
if I may
we gave
finish,
six, no,
if I
we
may
gave,
finish.
I'll reclaiming my time. We gave $6 billion on top of that exchange.
Again,
So
this,
what does that say, as my original question, what does that say about our policies with respect to sanctions? It says they mean nothing. That's what it says. It says they mean absolutely nothing.
First of all, this money.
And we all know that money is fungible. So what we're doing is freeing up $6 billion that Iran otherwise would have had to spend on humanitarian efforts to go fund terrorism once again. It is idiotic, truly.
This money can only be drawn on for food or medicine for the Iranian people, and that is a
but it is
stipulation.
freeing up $6 billion that they otherwise would have had to spend on food and water and humanitarian aid to go fund terrorism. This is the problem when you start negotiating with terrorist regimes.
Except that they have not been spending money on food or medicine for their own people, as you have seen. Listen, I would also make the point that we continue to have over hundreds of sanctions on Iranian entities and individuals for all of their nefarious and malign behavior around the world, and we will stay
Except we
vigilant
just
on that.
undercut that by unfreezing $6 billion in assets. Moving on to a different topic. If we included al-Qaeda in the new AUMF, but not the Taliban, could the Taliban later become a targetable associate force of al-Qaeda if the Taliban increased cooperation with them?
Yeah, I can take that question, sir. The answer is yes, particularly if the current draft committee proposal were enacted, and it would have the same associated forces construct that we have now.
Okay, given the extensive current al-Qaeda-Taliban cooperation that we see, what else would we have to see for the Taliban to be listed?
I think, Congressman, we would need to see actual Taliban facilitation of al-Qaeda's attacks on Americans. At this point, we're not seeing that, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me start by thanking Secretary Nuland and Secretary Blinken and the State Department for fighting very hard to try to get more jet fighters to Ukraine last March. The State Department understood the importance of air power and modern warfare. The State Department made the decision to win very early on in this war, and I thank the State Department for doing so. I have some questions about now the AUMF. I support repealing all their existing AUMFs because I believe they've been abused by both Republican and Democratic administrations. The hard part is putting in a new one. In 2015, the Obama administration tried to put in a new AUMF, as you recall. I came out against it pretty early on because as I read that AUMF, it was going to give the administration authority to put our personnel, men and women in our armed forces, in harm's way, and then handcuff them by not letting them to do what they need to win. It had a phrase basically saying, you could go fight the enemy, except you can't do enduring offensive ground combat operations, which made literally no sense, because why would you allow our troops to be in harm's way and not let them destroy the enemy? It would seem that if we're going to authorize force, we better give our military the ability to use the force they need to win. So I have a question for the panel. Do you think that limitation was good to have been in that 2015 AUMF? Would you want something like that, or would you oppose something like that?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. Speaking as a lawyer, I would prefer the formulation allowing the president to use all necessary and appropriate force.
Thank you. So I would agree with you on that. Now, it appears to me the panel does not like a time limitation. You don't seem like a sunset. I'm sort of curious why you'd be opposed to just listing additional groups like the Taliban. I mean, you don't have to use it. You don't have to use that authority. I'm just wondering, what is driving that? Are you working with the Taliban to do something you think this would offend them? What is sort of saying, no, we don't actually want this authority?
So, Congressman Liu, first of all, thank you for your comments on Ukraine and for your stalwart support of Ukraine against Russian aggression. With regard to the Taliban, three things here. First of all, they are making steady, if not sufficient, progress against ISIS-K. We have also said here that at the current moment, under the environment that they've created, al-Qaeda is at its weakest point in a long, long time.
Right. No, I understand the arguments you're making. I'm just wondering, if you don't want a time limitation in the AUMF, how do you know what the Taliban looks like in 7 years? And why wouldn't you just want that authority? I don't sort of get why the administration says, no, don't give us this authority.
I think we should probably have a consultation in a setting other than this one on some aspects of this.
Okay, that's fine.
With regard to a sunset, we've talked about being able to adjust in consultation the groups, et cetera, as needed. And as Chris said earlier, if the Taliban were to take a different stance vis-a-vis terrorist groups on their territory, and a significantly different one, obviously we would want them listed.
Thank you. I have questions about what you all view as force. So right now, let's say there were no AUMFs, the administration couldn't launch missiles at Iran. Could the administration launch a cyber attack on Iran without an AUMF? Is that force?
So depending on the facts and circumstances, a cyber attack could constitute a use of force, in which case it would need to be authorized either by Congress or by the President's Article 2 power.
Okay. If the administration had some special operations unit go and take out an Iranian scientist who was working on nuclear weapons, would that constitute force? Would the administration need an AUMF to do that?
Again, I prefer not to engage in hypotheticals, but a use of force would include killing an individual, yes.
Okay. And would a use of force include, let's say, the U.S. installing a computer virus on centrifuges that make them not work well? Would that constitute force?
I think it really depends on the circumstances, whether whatever it was that was being done constituted an actual use of force in terms of a kinetic. You know, as you may be aware, there are challenges in determining what in cyber actually constitutes a use of force, and so we've mainly kept to those things that we know would be a use of force in the more physical context.
Thank you. So my time is up. I just want to request the chairman to maybe set up a classified briefing on what constitutes force, especially in terms of cyber.
I think those are very good questions. I'd be happy to do so. Chair recognizes Mr. Self.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I've listened to this discussion back and forth, the panel has used the word depends and depending a lot. I understand, while I was not here, that you had a discussion about the War Powers Act, and basically the administration does not believe the War Powers Act is a constraint on the presidency. And that's where my concern lies, because I'm from Texas. We have an international situation on the southern border in which the president considers the Congress and the law irrelevant. And that informs my opinions about this discussion. Along with, I share Mr. Waltz's concerns, because I've not been in Afghanistan as recently as he has been. I was there very early. But I want to ask you about, and the first question will maybe get at it, is there any consideration in the administration to recognize the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan?
No, we have not taken that up, and we do not intend to.
So what do you consider the situation of Taliban in Afghanistan today? How do you characterize it?
They have self-described themselves as assuming governing authority in Afghanistan.
No, how do you consider it? Who governs Afghanistan?
They are, in their own telling, endeavoring to govern Afghanistan, but we don't consider this authority that they have assumed to be constitutional within Afghanistan's own circumstances. Rich, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, thank you for the question. At this point, we don't recognize any entity as the government of Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's. I think you're absolutely correct. We have discussed permutations here. I like some of the issues, some of the suggestions that have been made, but in my opinion, this administration will take liberties with whatever this body and the U.S. Senate pass and agree to, and even if it's signed, I think they will take liberties. So I've heard lists, I've heard time, I've heard global. From my career in the military, I want it to be as broad as possible, and that will actually relieve us of the administration taking liberties. But there also is Mr. Crow's concern that Congress must have the vote. However we work that out, Congress must have a vote that is meaningful in this AUMF replacement. So I'm going to go ahead and yield back my time. Those are my concerns. And again, Mr. Chairman, I want this to be tight enough that the administration will find it hard-pressed to take liberties with it without the congressional say-so.
Thank you, sir. Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for your patience. It's been a long day. It's been a long week for most of us here. And Ambassador Nuland, I want to thank you for clarifying that the United States doesn't take hostages. We have, just in the course of my lifetime, I can think of prisoner swaps with the former Soviet Union, with current-day Russia, with other countries. We do not take hostages. We do not hold hostages. We deal with other countries who are taking American citizens, and we've always had to make very difficult choices. As I turn our attention now to the AUMF, look, I think there's universal agreement on the dais that Congress has, as it should, the sole authority to declare war, as well as the authority to raise and support armies.
The administration has its own authorities under Article 2, but at the end of the day, and we've talked about the War Powers Act, we've talked about other things, it is Congress's responsibility. I think all of us will say here, and I know we say it when we go home, that the most difficult decision we ever face as a member of Congress is when to send American men and women into harm's way, defending our nation, protecting our freedoms, but also laying their lives on the line. And this is something we do have to take seriously. I wasn't here in 2001 or 2002 when the decisions were taken then, but I have been here for now pretty much a decade. I'm in my fifth term. We have not been able to express our voice necessarily on these. It is critical, and I agree with my colleague, Mr. Crow, that Congress has to have its say and evaluate these. But I also have real concerns about this idea of an absolute sunset. I'd like to explore that a little bit with you. And maybe you've talked about this because we've had to come and go. But what are some of the implications of a date certain that a authority ends on December 31st, 2029?
Congressman Schneider, let me just first reiterate, because I didn't get a chance to answer Congressman Crow. Obviously, Article 1 powers are for the Congress alone. We are your invited guests to engage in a conversation about where you might take this based on our experiences implementing the legislation that you have, we have in front of us, and we thank you for that. Let me just say that with regard to sunset, I think we've made crisper over the course of this hearing the three concerns that we have. Number one, a date certain tells our adversaries, tells every terrorist out there that they can go into their hole and wait us out and come back out on that date certain if Congress is not able to act. That's number one. Number two, detention authorities. You know, if there's a lapse, we will not have the authority we need to continue to detain. And then the last one, which, you know, for those of us who spend our lives building international coalitions, if the United States doesn't lead, coalitions rarely cohere. And when our partners and allies are not sure that our authorities persist, they are less likely to ensure that they have the authority absent us. So those are the three reasons.
I think that's important. Look, we have the greatest military force in the world. We should all be rightly proud of that. But I think our secret weapon is our convening power as a nation, that ability to lead. So I agree with you, and that comes from the authority, and the authorities really matter. As I've been sitting here listening, I've been thinking, you know, how do wars in previous times come to an end? You know, you can sue for peace. There's an armistice. There's a truce. There's a treaty. We tend to think of wars as a conflict between nation states, that people get together at a table or on the deck of a battleship and say, this war has come to an end. We will agree to this, that, and the other thing. We're in a different time. We're in a different place. My colleague at the beginning of the questioning asked you, what will the threat landscape look like in 2045? He picked that number for a specific reason. That is as far to the future as we are today from when the first AUMF was authorized. We don't know. But I think I can say with some degree of confidence that in the conflict we're fighting today, where we're trying to resolve what we do here, there is not going to be a peace treaty with al-Qaeda or a cessation of hostilities with ISIS. It's going to be a war that we're going to have to win, as Mr. Crow said. We're going to have to define success and recognize it in our own terms, in our own way, at our own time. And it is imperative, I agree with Mr. Crow, this Congress has to make our voice heard. It's essential that the debates take place on the floor and in the committee rooms of the House and the Senate. And we have to figure out a way to do that. And I'm running out of time, but I think it's really important that we understand what the implications of sunsets are, what we ask, how we answer the questions of why, who, what, where, and when in a way that doesn't hamstring our nation, but allows us to lead our allies and make sure that we keep our citizens safe, our interests protected, and our role in the world as a leader preserved. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Dr. McCormick.
Hopefully that's not a sign. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. In earlier testimony, we were talking, and I'll get right to the point because I know time is short. Congresswoman Wagner asked about the Iran-based militias, and you discussed how in the last 6 months there's been a decrease in violence. We talked about the inclusion in the AUMF. Obviously, there's been a drop, but we know that they, in Iraq, killed around 600 of ours. They've also had 80 attacks in the last 2 years. We talked about needing a 5-year report. For the record, do we have that report available?
Congressman, we can compile that report. We have not done specifically a 5-year report, but that information is in our possession.
Okay, when can we get that?
We can turn it as quickly as we can pull people together to put that information in within some number of weeks, or assuming no government shutdown.
I hate that answer. Some number of weeks is way too vague for me. Can we assume within 4 weeks?
Congressman, I think we can get that information to you within 4 weeks if
Great.
the government's open.
I'll leave it at that. I'll hold you to your word. Also, just so you know, I was paying attention at least during the time I was here. I heard you specifically say, Mr. Mayor, Al-Qaeda is not significantly planning to harm Western interests. I wrote that down because I thought, well, that's interesting. We know that Al-Qaeda is training people in Afghanistan in several regions under the protection of the Taliban, which is kind of how we end up in this situation to begin with. If they're not training to harm Western interests, what are they training for?
Congressman, I think what we see on balance in what I can talk about in this forum is not al-Qaeda having the capability or the intent under the current Taliban regime to be able to strike at the United States.
So, as a veteran of the Persian Gulf and Afghanistan, I dispute that claim. I don't think they ever have an intent not to harm us. They've been openly and significantly in contrary to everything that we stand for, and would do great harm to us if they were able to. They may not be able to right now, but I think you mistake their intent. That's just my opinion. As far as in review of the Taliban's association with Al-Qaeda, I'm just going to go on further with this, and I'm going to shift from you, Mr. Mayor. On July 22nd, 2022, the CIA's Special Activities Center drone over Kabul fired 2 Hellfire missiles, killing al-Zawahiri, and the emir of Al-Qaeda. At the time, al-Zawahiri enjoyed Taliban protection in a house owned by the leader of the Haqqani network. On June 1st, a report released in the United Nations confirmed that there are between 30 and 60 senior Al-Qaeda officials in country, 400 fighters in country, at least 3 Al-Qaeda members in the Taliban government. So there's an obvious link between Al-Qaeda and Taliban. They've been very open about their intentions towards the West and towards us and what they intend to do. I think they're violent people. They're training for violent things. Undersecretary Nuland, do you agree with the UN's report assessment? And would you agree that the Taliban is currently supporting and enabling terrorist groups, and we can call Al-Qaeda a terrorist group, that they're associated with?
Congressman, as we've said here, one of the things that we have documented, and most recently by the public comments of Christy Abizaid of the National Counterterrorism Center, is regardless of the protection that they continue to have under the Taliban, Al-Qaeda's capabilities and membership have shrunk significantly. They're at the lowest level, and we don't assess that they have the capability.
So we're going back to
hit us.
capabilities. Let me talk about intent. At one time, we didn't have a problem with Al-Qaeda at all. It didn't exist. We've seen terrorist organizations wax and wane in the past. The question goes back to integrated inside the Taliban. The reason that they've been weakened is because we fought a war for 20 years there, which I was part of. That's why they don't have the capability. We're no longer there. Thanks to politicians, we withdrew after we won the war. where we had stabilized the nation with 2,500 people. We're losing less than a dozen people in 10 years. We withdrew. Now they're incorporated in the Taliban government. Their training bases are there inside of a country that trained people to kill us originally. That's why we went there in the first place. So let's not say that they're too weak to attack us, because that's really myopic thinking. We started, and I'm going to finish because I'm out of time, but we started this without a problem until those training bases in Al-Qaeda and other organizations inside of a foreign government ruled by the same government that exists there now harbored these people that crashed 4 planes into United States territory, killing thousands of people. And then we fought a 2-decade war only to give it back to the same people who are now harboring terrorist groups again. The same people, Taliban, harboring terrorist organizations, dozens of bases training to do harm. And I don't know if you think it's not against Western interests. I'd like to know what interests it's against, because I've never seen a terrorist organization that was pro-West or pro-United States. I'm pretty sure they're anti-United States and anti-Semite. With that, I rest.
Did you want to respond?
You know what, I think the Congressman just made the point for a continued AUMF and continued Article 2 ability to strike as the President authorized against Zawahiri, and to remain vigilant.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. McCormick. Just let me ask you, if in reading the prepared testimony, I was late because I was at a meeting on combating anti-Semitism, and then I was on the floor with the foreign ops bill, so I apologize, I did not hear your presentations, but in reading through at least one of them, and I'll read the others later, it seems that you're suggesting that the President doesn't really need the AUMF because he has the inherent power to use force, as Mr. Visek puts it, to protect the national security interests of the United States. But as I think the lawyers on the panel understand, that view is only an opinion internal to the executive branch. It has never been ratified by Congress in law or affirmed by the Supreme Court. In fact, the one law that on the books that addresses the issue, the War Powers Resolution, spells out in far more a limited view of the President's power to act without congressional authority. According to the War Powers Resolution, the President's constitutional powers to introduce U.S. forces into hostilities, quote, are exercised only pursuant to 1, a declaration of war, 2, specific statutory authorization, or 3, a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces, a close quote. In other words, the law says that the President can only use force with congressional authorization or after we've been attacked. So just to be very clear, are you saying that you are not bound by that portion of the 50 U.S.C. Code, Section 1541 that I just quoted? Mr. Visek?
Thank you, Congressman. Just a couple points of clarification.
Sure.
First, I think with respect to Article 2 authorities, we don't see them as unbounded. We do see them as limited by the Declare War Clause. That's why we've characterized our exercise of the Article 2 authorities in this space as episodic, defensive in nature, intended to deter. We see the value in the AUMF of providing a prolonged authority. Now, I realize that there have been, debates over the years about whether the War Powers Resolution, addresses all the instances that might arise under an Article 2 context. But the point is that this administration, and I think many administrations, have acted consistently with the War Powers Resolution, such that the legal debates don't have to be engaged. And I think the way this all gets tied together, I think, is look, there are instances where Article 2 authorities are appropriate and useful. We've noted how they've been used in the context of the Iran-aligned militia groups, but where we have a prolonged need for enduring authority to engage in not just defensive but also offensive acts, the authorizations are vital. And I think that is consistent with this notion, and without weighing in one way or the other on the ultimate legality, but the idea that the War Powers Resolution has this 60-day clock, that tends to reinforce this notion that when we're in it for a longer term, we want Congress on board.
Let me just ask one other question, and I'll yield to my distinguished colleague. Do you have any concerns that the deal with Iran will incentivize any further hostage-taking? Ms. Nuland?
We obviously made clear, Congressman Smith, that this deal needed to be the end of this kind of practice. And frankly, this was a long negotiation. It was a difficult one. And when you look at the balance here, getting our Americans back who'd been wrongfully detained and their 2 family members was extremely important to do, to underscore to Iran that this kind of behavior doesn't, in fact, pay and makes everything else from their international reputation to the relationship that they say they want with the international community harder.
In looking at the Iranians who were released, if what I read was accurate, they're mostly for crimes of sanctions. Are there any terrorists among them? That we released to Iran, not the Americans. They were hostages and victims.
My memory of this, Rich may correct me, is that they were all charged for criminal behavior.
Yeah. But was the criminality?
Not terrorist behavior, but sanctions violations and or drugs or other things. Yeah.
I thought. And finally, again, on the incentivization of hostage-taking, when the negotiations were ongoing about the amount of money, were there various proposals put forward for less or more? Or I mean, $6 billion is what I know where that's coming from, but how did that get on the table? I mean, that's a lot of money. And as Mr. Lawler pointed out, money is fungible. And I remember I met with Zarif once when we were trying to get Pastor Abedini out of Iran because he was wrongfully held as well. It was appalling to me that he said, oh, your sanctions. He knows that I wrote the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. He did his homework. And he goes, the sanctions are causing Iranian women to be trafficked. And he made this big spiel. I said, well, change your behavior. Stop your human rights abuse against your own people. But he did use that as a lever. And I'm just wondering, when it came to the $6 billion, what was on the table?
Congressman, let's have a private discussion about the interstices of the negotiation. If you'd like, you can imagine that Iran had a higher price tag at one point. This was a particular chunk of money that was held by a U.S. ally at our request, et cetera. I want to go back to another point you made, which is arbitrary detention of Americans and deterring it. This is a major priority of Secretary Blinken and our team. And we are working with other international partners, including Canada. There was a meeting on this at the UN General Assembly last week to increase deterrence measures in common, so to ensure that countries that do this, from Russia to Iran to North Korea, pay a steep price, and it's a consistent multilateral price.
Thank you. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panel. I'm sorry I'm late, but I was at the impeachment hearing, which was a real treat. And let me just say, some of my colleagues on the other side want to have an AUMF that specifically cites Taliban. I wish they'd been equally concerned about the Taliban when the previous president, President Trump, ordered negotiations under Ambassador Khalilzad, I think in Doha. Was it not, Ms. Nolan?
It was, Congressman Connolly.
Yes. And is it not true that the president authorized negotiations without the presence of the then Afghan government we were purportedly supporting, so that the negotiations were directly with the Taliban without representatives of the Afghan government? Is that true?
That is correct, at least for the majority of the time.
And is it not also true that under President Trump and Ambassador Khalilzad, Those negotiations led to the release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners, many of whom we'd tagged as terrorists. Is that correct?
Also correct.
Thank you. Ms. Nuland, I have to say, I think the administration is going to have trouble with an AUMF on the Democratic side. And let me cite two aspects of your testimony today. One is you say you want an AUMF without sunset provisions. You don't want an expiration date. Is that correct? Is that your testimony?
Congressman, in your absence, we spoke about our concerns about a date certain and what that would do in terms of empowering terrorists to wait us out, concerns about losing our detention authority, concerns about our partners worry about our staying power.
Yes.
However, we did hear during the course of the hearing put on the table a number of new ideas or ideas that we've been talking with committee staff about for ensuring that there is, that the Congress has the opportunity to cancel this legislation as needed.
You, I was informed, but thank you. And I certainly concede the complexity and nuance of the issue and why we have to tread delicately on that. But, you know, I'm a child of the Vietnam War, and I remember vividly the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was supposed to be a limited reaction to two events, alleged events, in the Gulf of Tonkin. And the President of the United States, then a Democrat, Lyndon Johnson, used that resolution as an open-ended commitment, and we didn't end that war until 11 years later. In ignominy, maybe, but we ended it. Never did Congress intend that that resolution would be used to justify 500,000 U.S. troops being introduced onto the soil of Vietnam. And so I hope you can appreciate there's deep sensitivity here about the issue of an expiration date, though we're not unmindful of the points you make. And so I think that's got to be worked out if we're going to have common ground. The other is, I think your testimony also said that you didn't want us to, you wanted to be able to have an AUMF that authorized introduction of troops or some military presence to new geographic areas and groups as needed, quote unquote. Is that correct? Your microphone.
Sorry. Yes, I think what we were reflecting there was the fact that the greatest rise of terrorism currently is in the Sahel as a result of recent coups in government systems. So, and we have been able, all of those, the groups that we work against with our allies and partners there are affiliates of al-Qaeda, but we want to be able to work with you and say, hey, this thing has morphed and moved and renamed itself.
And again, I don't think there's a desire to hamstring the administration in responding quickly to emergency situations. We're not unsupportive of that. But again, if you think about the history and you think about Article 1 of the Constitution of the United States, which has been, diluted over many decades with the compliance of Congress, nonetheless, the war power is exclusively granted to the Congress of the United States under the Constitution. And so circumscribing that power is something we need to do in a responsible way, working with you. But an open-ended commitment with respect to geography and groups as needed, the downside of that is maybe you would never abuse it. You'd never do anything untoward. But that doesn't mean your successor would not gleefully take that open-ended authority and use it in ways never envisioned by the Congress and not supported by the American people. And so I just think, especially in those two areas, we understand the desire of any administration to want flexibility. But I hope the administration understands the desire of the legislative branch on both sides to circumscribe that flexibility in the interest of constitutional prerogatives. And the prerogative of war making is exclusively granted to the Congress of the United States. And, you know, we talk about implied powers for the executive. It's time we talk about implied powers under Article 1 that are legislative powers. And so this is a necessary dialogue, but I think it is a necessary dialogue. And speaking on the Democratic side of the aisle, and I know some of my colleagues previously raised concerns about this, let me add my voice to it. Happy to work with you, but we're very reluctant to grant broad new authorities that are not circumscribed by time and geography. And with that, I yield back. Unless Ms. Nuland wants to respond, she's more than welcome to, if you will allow, Mr. Chairman. I thank my friend.
Thank you, Congressman Conley. I think this is a perfect ending, I think, to this hearing. We very much appreciate understanding that these powers are yours, the opportunity to come and present and to be in conversation about how we go forward here. We have, I think, over the course of this hearing, teased out a number of options that might bridge the gap here to ensure that Congress is regularly reviewing both the geography, the lists, the authorities, and we would welcome that, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of Chairman McCaul and the committee, I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we respectfully ask that you respond in writing to those questions. Pursuant to the committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.